We got a topper bill.
Good morning.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call this Basic Education Funding Commission meeting to order and ask Ms. Wilkin to please call the roll.
Here.
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 Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, we couldn't hear her.
Thank you, Senator. Do want to note that Senator Lindsey Williams, Senator Dave Argall, and Representative Ryan Warner are joining us virtually. And if I could ask them all to please mute, the system's going to work a little bit better. Thank you.
In other words, you, Dave Argall.
So with that, I'm State Senator Kristen Phillips-Hill, and as co-chair of the commission, I would like to welcome you all to the 28th Senatorial District, and specifically Penn Township. And I want to once again thank all of those members of the public who are here in person, who are watching virtually, and give a very special thank you to the fine folks at Southwestern School District who are our gracious hosts here today. And today marks the 5th meeting of this commission since we started taking the meetings on the road to hear from stakeholders all across our Commonwealth. And while the list of testifiers here today may be a little shorter than our previous meetings, I think it's going to allow this commission to roll up its sleeves and get into the finer points of what we need to accomplish, which is how, and I'm going to borrow an illustration from a prior hearing and testifier, it's how we adjust the pipes of how funding flows from the state to our schools through the basic education funding formula. And I want to welcome all of our testifiers who have spent a considerable amount of time on their respective testimonies and thank them for lending their expertise to this commission and helping us accomplish our shared bipartisan goals. And with that, I will turn it over to my co-chair, the good representative from Lancaster County, Mike Sterla, to offer some additional comments.
Thanks, and I'll be brief because to date we've run between an hour and a half late on every meeting, and so I see that my counterpart, Senator Phillips-Hill, just cut out the number of people testifying, and that helps. but seriously, though, there's a lot of work to be done here, and there's a lot of great information that we've been getting to date, and I look forward to hearing more because this is a big task at hand. We have a lot at stake here, particularly given the recent court ruling that said that the way we fund education in the state of Pennsylvania is unconstitutional. And so, therefore, it is, I think, critical that we get it right this time. So, thank you.
Thank you, Representative. So I'd like to call up our first testifier. She is Ms. Hannah Barrick, and she serves as the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Association of School Business Officials. So, Ms. Barrick, if I could, before you begin, can we swear you in? Fantastic. Please rise. Raise your right hand. Hannah, do you swear that the testimony that you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. And if so, please indicate by saying I do. Thank you very much. And please proceed when you are ready.
Okay. All right. I have a PowerPoint presentation just to make everything a little bit easier. I have 39 pages or 38 pages of testimony, so I don't want to panic anybody. Really appreciate the opportunity to sort of sit here in front of the commission. Thank you, Senator Phillips-Hill. Thank you, Representative Sterla, for chairing this commission as we go through this important work. PASBO has spent a lot of time. We worked with the original Basic Education Funding Commission back in 2014-15. Is that a little bit better? Okay, perfect. Perfect. And we have really looked at, studied, worked through, and tried to understand exactly how the formula has worked year after year, understanding how each of the individual metrics in that formula have worked. And we are 9 years into that formula. It's a really complex formula. It does a really good job, in our opinion, of working to distribute resources to districts that need them the most based on their student population, based on their district demographics. And so what we're presenting today is really a look at that formula, how it has worked, what we have noticed 9 years in, areas for some adjustment or improvement to make that formula a little bit better, and then some other considerations as the commission is doing its work over the next several months. So we're just going to start with the first or the second slide, which is just high level, what is BEF? And I know this is the 5th hearing, so you have heard this before, I know, but just to kind of paint the picture and set the stage again, BEF is the largest state subsidy to school districts. It's the largest single subsidy in the entire state budget, $7.8 billion for this fiscal year. That is about 20% of overall school district expenditures. So it's big, but is still just a portion of the sort of total sort of in comparison to those expenditures. BEF is not an expenditure category. It's not an area. There are not expenditures linked to it. It's a broad, flexible category of funds that school districts can use for any purpose. It's staffing, it is programs, it is special education, it's charter school tuition, it is school facilities. It is a really broad, flexible bucket of money. And it's made up of 2 components. One is the stable base. That's generally for most districts the amount that was locked in place 2014-15 when the original commission met. For a lot of districts that have had level up or some other adjustments, that has increased a bit over time. But that's just around $6 billion of that total. And then there's the dynamic formula. That's the BEF part. That's about $2 billion this current fiscal year. That's what we're going to be talking about as we go through this. As I said before on the next slide, we think it's a really good formula. The commission originally spent a lot of time trying to understand what was driving costs in school districts, where additional resources were needed, looked at other formulas outside of Pennsylvania, looked at past Pennsylvania formulas, and sort of designed a formula to distribute resources to districts with greatest need, changing need in their student population, took into account district demographic factors to sort of make adjustments. And the formula is intended to be dynamic and change as district demographics and populations change. And it's also really factor specific. One thing we know, particularly 9 years in, is that it treats every school district very uniquely. There are no 2 districts that are alike through the formula. You can't make the assumption that all rural school districts are treated the same or all urban school districts are treated the same. There are so many different moving components that every school district is treated very, very uniquely, which is a really sort of interesting component that we have really started to recognize over time. The next slide just gives you kind of an ugly snapshot of what this formula does. The top line basically is just, this is a student population piece. We're going to look at the kids in every school district, residing in every school district, and we're going to look at what their needs are based on different populations. The bottom line is we're going to look at the district-specific factors. So what's the local wealth? What's the tax effort? Are they able to benefit from economies of scale? And we're going to sort of do all the math and basically prorate your individual school district share to the total. That's sort of in a nutshell how the formula works. So I'm going to just run through the formula really high level. We included a lot more data in the testimony to sort of understand how it has been working, provide examples, and do some 9-year snapshots. But we've highlighted a couple of them just for you to take a look at. The next slide really just talks about, we start with, in this formula, counting the number of kids in a district. And we count them based on ADMs, that's average daily membership, the number of kids a school district is financially responsible for. So it is the number of kids you're educating. It is the charter school students you're paying tuition for. It might be other students you're paying tuition for who are attending a school outside of the district. They're all counted together. And the formula uses a 3-year average that again moves as we move forward. And what we have experienced overall in Pennsylvania is that most school districts are declining in their share and in their number of ADMs. We know this is a demographic trend that Pennsylvania is struggling with as well. But the flip side of that is 139 are increasing their ADMs. The next slide just gives you the 9-year snapshot, what that looks like. So across all 500 school districts, we have for the current formula year, this 23-24, there's about 1.7 million ADMs. Again, that's the 3-year average. But you can see over time how the number of ADMs in Pennsylvania has declined. And again, this is tied to the sort of demographic challenges we know that the state is facing. But that's where the formula starts. Every district starts with the number of kids that they have they're financially responsible for educating. We then move on to adding some weights on the next slide for in a couple of categories, looking at individual student populations. We look at the number of students living in 3 different categories of poverty. And the formula uses federal American Community Survey census data to sort of define the income thresholds that provides a percentage of students, a percentage of children in each school district within those income levels. And then there is a weight that is applied to that. Those weights were determined through a survey with the Independent Fiscal Office, with the original BEF Commission. They did some work to sort of look at those differences. So there's a weight for students living in acute poverty, students living below the federal poverty line, which is like below $30,000 based on the data that's used. It's 2021 data, census data lags. It comes out in December every year. This December, we'll get the 2022 census data. There's a weight for poverty, that's students living between 100 184% of the federal poverty line. And then there's a concentrated poverty weight for districts that have 30% or more of their students living below the federal poverty line. The next slide sort of just gives you a sense of what this looks like across districts, looking at both the acute poverty percentage, this is the average statewide percentage, that is in the blue, and the orange is the that poverty percentage. The average statewide percentage is in the orange. Again, you can see that the trend across Pennsylvania over the years of the formula is that both of these have declined slightly. However, that's certainly not the case in every school district. The range for the percentage of students living in acute poverty is like 1% to 65% across 500 school districts. The range for students living in poverty is 1% to about 42% across 500 school districts. So again, this gives you the statewide perspective. The snapshot in every district is extremely, extremely different. The next slide provides an example or a sort of look at the districts that are qualifying for concentrated poverty. Again, this is where you have 30% or more of your students living below the federal poverty line. So we have on average every year about 40 to 45 school districts that qualify for this additional weight. The challenge is they're not the same districts every year, right? So districts are sort of qualifying and not qualifying on an annual basis. But this is sort of a handful of districts that receive that additional weight in this formula. And again, relatively static number of districts, but they're not the same, and we can talk about that in a second. The next slide just tries to bring this all together. So here's the poverty, here's the math that sort of happens behind the scenes in the formula. Sort of example school district, you can see their acute poverty percentage is 32, their poverty percentage is 26. They've got 1,000 students in that sort of single year of ADM that is applied to this weight. you just do the math. You multiply their 1,000 times 32% times the appropriate weight of 0.6. You sort of get 192 additional ADMs that you're going to add on to that 3-year average that we started with. You do the same for the poverty weight, the concentrated poverty, and you're going to add on 366 additional students as a result of this example school district's poverty calculation. So we do that, and then we move on to the next slide, which just applies the other 2 student weights that we have. One is for English language learners. For the current fiscal year formula, there's about 88,000 English language learners across the state. And then there's a weight for charter schools, recognizing financial impact of students attending a charter school, stranded costs related to that. There's about 168,000 students attending charter schools. So again, those are the other 2 student components. And then you kind of add everything together. So the next slide gives you a snapshot of what that looks like. And I sort of the slide after this sort of boils it all down a little bit, just in terms of we're going to add all these things together really quickly. But if we can go back to the slide that you just went off of, thank you, perfect. This gives you a sense of what this looks like. How many kids we're actually adding on to that 3-year average ADM that we started with, which was like 1.7 million. We're adding on for this year about 360,000 additional ADMs as a result of poverty, English language learners, and charter schools. So we're sort of elevating that number we started with by 360,000. So every school district is going into the second half of this formula with a number that is greater than where they started, because every school district is adding on students. They have students in those categories. So if we move forward a couple of slides, we sort of give an example on the next slide, just sort of the top and the bottom. We go back one. There we go, perfect. This gives you a sort of look at the extent to which those additional ADMs are really sort of adding on to that 3-year average ADM. So you can see we've got the top and the bottom here for 23-24. In some school districts at the top, the amount of students they're adding on through this process, because they have really low poverty, they don't have a lot of English language learners, they don't have a lot of charter school students, they're adding on 1%, 2% of what their 3-year average ADMs is. The other end of the spectrum, we've got districts that are adding on more than 50%, up to almost 70%, because of the population of students they have. Really high poverty, a lot of English language learners, a lot of charter school students, probably qualifying for concentrated poverty. So you can see there's a lot of variation, again, specific to each individual district. The next slide looks at the next piece of this. There is a district weight that is applied for those districts that are really, really small, really, really rural. You have to be really spread out geographically, really small population-wise. And it's looking at ADMs and your ADMs per square mile. This is a sparsity size adjustment, pretty similar to the metric that's used in special education, but this is adding on about 11,000 ADMs across the state to 150 school districts. Again, you have to be above the 70th percentile here. But again, the adjustment here is adding 1 to, I think, 142 ADMs, so not a huge adjustment, but this is really to recognize that some school districts that, again, small population-wise, really spread out, they can't benefit from economies of scale. They cannot, consolidate to one building because they are really spread out. Kids can't be on the bus. So there are additional costs that accrue as a result of that. So we add that on, and then we get to a really important part of the formula, which is using the multipliers. And on the next slide, we sort of talk high level about the multipliers. There are 2. And these are the district factors. One is the median household income index. That's the proxy for local wealth. The other is local effort capacity index. That's looking at the burden on taxpayers. That's looking at the capacity of the district to generate revenue at the local level. And one thing that we have learned 9 years into this formula is that these multipliers have a really big impact on the sort of end result and the amount a school district is going to have to kind of prorate through that formula. These multipliers, mathematically, it can be above 1 or less than 1. So when you are multiplying by them, that is either really significantly inflating or deflating the amount that you started with. So really important for districts to understand where their multipliers are right now and how they are trending. If we go on to the next slide, we'll just sort of run through these very quickly. The first one is median household income. And again, that's looking at a school district's median household income and sort of looking at that in comparison to the state median. Are you wealthier than the state median? Are you poorer than the state median? If you're wealthier in your school district, you're going to have a median household income index, a multiplier that's less than 1. You're wealthier, we're going to sort of pull your number down. If you're poorer than the state median, it will be greater than 1, and it will lift you up. And you can see on the slide the 67,587. That is the sort of benchmark. That's the state median that school districts are sort of judged against for the current fiscal year. And the next slide just sort of gives you what that has looked like over time. So again, this is the target, the state median that we're going to look at each individual school district's data in comparison to. It has grown since 15-16 by almost $14,500. So pretty significant growth at the median. Some districts are growing much faster than that. Some districts are growing much slower than that. So it's not only where you are in comparison to the median, but it is how you have grown from year to year, what really sort of impacts that. So we know that much like the poverty metrics and the poverty data, this is definitely COVID impacted data as well, and we can see that. That this is using federal data from 2021, most recently available. And we know this is a challenge with a lot of the data points that we have. There is a COVID impact, and it's going to take a couple of years for that to sort of move through the system. But this is an area certainly where that is having impact. The next slide just kind of gives you the top and the bottom. So this is for the current fiscal year. These are the top and the bottom median household income of school districts across the state, and you can see their sort of corresponding median household income index multiplier. So again, the poorest school district, just under $30,000. They have the highest multiplier. You sort of go to the other end of the list. The wealthiest school district for this current fiscal year, based on that 2021 federal data, they have the lowest multiplier for this fiscal year. And everybody else is somewhere in between those. The next slide looks at the other multiplier, which is, they sort of noted in the testimony, it's a really complex multiplier. There's two pieces of it. It has a lot of data points that are coming together. There's sort of a lot more math here than there is sort of anywhere else in the formula. But it's looking at two pieces, your local effort and sort of looking at a school district's local effort kind of in comparison to the median. It's looking at your capacity to generate local revenue, again, in comparison to the median. So the local effort index is looking at a school district's total tax-related revenue. It sort of looks at it on a per household basis. And then it sort of adjusts that expenditure or adjusts that local effort index a little bit for districts that are spending a little bit more per weighted student than the state median. So when the original BEF Commission came together, they added this sort of adjustment here for the purpose of ensuring that school districts were not incentivized to tax really high for the purpose of spending really high. So if a school district is spending more in its current expenditures, which is really its spending on instruction and supports and operations, it doesn't include things like facilities and items like that. If they're spending more in that than the sort of state average, which is, or median, is $15,309, we're going to sort of bring their local effort index down a little bit. If you're spending under that, there's no downward adjustment. And then the capacity side is just, again, looking at a district's ability to generate revenue on a per student basis at the local level. It uses market value, personal income. School districts, again, total tax-related revenue is pulled into that. And again, you're sort of judged based on, are you generating more or less than the state median for the current fiscal year? That's about $8,200. Not every district gets an adjustment here, just those that are underneath. If you're generating above that, basically says you've got a robust tax base or capacity, you don't need any additional support. The next slide just gives you some examples of both of those to sort of start to understand. The top is looking at that local effort index and really focusing on whether there is an adjustment downward based on the current expenditures per weighted student or whether there's not. So if you look at Upper St. Clair, You can see their local effort factor. They're taxing, above generally the median. The burden on that sort of household is higher than the median, but they're spending more than that median amount. So we're going to pull that local effort index down. Reading School District under them, again, they're taxing just a little bit under that state median, but they're also spending under the state median. So we're not going to bring that number down. Their local effort index sort of moves across that column the same. And then the bottom chart is really just looking at those districts, some districts that have that local capacity index. So again, you can see all those districts are spending below that $8,200 in that local capacity per weighted student calculation in the formula. And they get bumped up, sort of the difference between in comparison to what they're spending and that state median. So they're going to have that little bit of a bonus added on. So you take the local effort index, you take the local capacity index, you add them together, and that becomes the second multiplier for the formula. And again, we provided some other data in the testimony to sort of take a look at that. The next slide is really just putting it all together. So here is an example of the math of the formula. You're adding all the poverty weights together and the student weights. You're adding that to the 3-year average ADMs. You're multiplying by the two multipliers, median household income, local effort capacity index, and you are coming up with that school district's share of ADMs through the formula. And you can see that this example school district ends up with 2,300 ADMs, which is almost twice what they started with their 3-year average ADMs. The next slide just sort of looks at overall what that 3-year average ADM we started with, if you remember, is about 1.7 million. Once we do all the math of the formula, we've bumped that up to 2.6 million. So through all the math of the formula, the student factors, the district factors, we have added almost 1 million ADMs to that process. Again, it's going to look different in every single school district. And if you go to the next slide, you can see some of the examples of how this works. Some school districts, once you do the math of the formula, they actually have more students. Some school districts have less students. Their multipliers are pulling them down. They're less than 1 in some cases. They're greater than 1 in another case. If you look at Cumberland Valley, for example, that's sort of on the top. Their total weighted student count is about 11,000. But they've got one multiplier that's pretty significantly below 1. So that is sort of pulling them down. The total formula ADMs they have are just about 8,200. Harrisburg City is right below them. They have the opposite. Both of their multipliers are pretty significantly above 1. That's lifting them up. And you can even see Solanco School District below them. They are pretty much flat. They start and end, with the same. Their multipliers are just about 1. So really different outcome for every single school district based on their student population and their district demographics. The next slide sort of gives you a couple of snapshots here, looking at, again, the student-weighted additions, ADM additions, sort of as a percent of your total ADMs at the end before you utilize the multipliers in the yellow, and then after you utilize the multipliers in the gray. So you can see the impact, certainly, that those multipliers and then the district demographic factors have, and how this has been pretty static over time of the years of the formula. Finally, we get to the end, and we are just calculating every school district share. So the next slide kind of walks through what that means. You just take each school district's sort of formula ADMs. After you do all that math for each district, you divide by that total number of ADMs, which for the current fiscal year is about 2.6 million. And that determines your school district's share of the overall BEF pie. You multiply by that overall pie, which for this year is just about $2 billion. And that gives your school district how much they're getting in the BEF formula. So our example school district gets about $1.77 million. You add that then to whatever they're getting in that BEF base, and that becomes their BEF subsidy for that year. And so again, the pieces that change every year in this are like every single data element here for every district, along with the number of total ADMs across the state and the dollar amount that is available to sort of distribute through the BEF formula. The next slide really is a good example of how we look at this at PASBO. So trying to look at this through the lens of our members. What do our members need as school business managers in particular? They really need predictability from year to year and trying to understand, do they have the resources to add programs, to sustain programs, to add staff, to sustain staff? What does that mean for their local revenue? What are their needs? Can they plan for projects? What can they do over multiple fiscal years? And so to sort of help them with that, we really look at this formula based on what is happening to a school district, every school district's share of that overall BEF pie. Is it growing? Is it shrinking? And what are the trends there? That is sort of how to help school districts try to find some predictability here. For the current fiscal year from last year, most school districts have been experiencing an increasing share of BEF, with about 190 the opposite. But if you're a school district with a declining share, that doesn't mean that you're necessarily receiving less in BEF from year to year. It really depends on the extent of how much that share has declined, but also how much additional dollars have been put into the BEF formula appropriation. And the next slide just sort of shows, here's the top, some of the districts with the largest share increases from last year to this year. And again, it is a combination of large urban schools, small rural schools, and suburban schools in between. It is all over the place. And the next slide just talks about, okay, what are the common reasons for share gain? Districts with increasing ADMs, increasing numbers of students in poverty. They might qualify now for a concentrated poverty rate. Their median household income might be growing slower than that state median. Their local effort may have increased. It's usually a combination of all those things, and those are sort of what catapults school districts to that top. The flip side of that is school districts are declining share every year too, or sporadically. So the next slide sort of shows from last year to this year the bottom. These are the school districts that had the largest share loss from last year to this year. And again, it's a little bit of the same story. Some big urban school districts, some small rural school districts, some suburban school districts in between. And again, what are the reasons for share loss? On the next slide is really sort of the flip. They might have declining ADMs. Their poverty percentages might be decreasing. They might not qualify for concentrated poverty anymore. Their median household income might be increasing, maybe faster than the state median. A combination of all of these things, it really sort of explains that. But again, this is sort of the way that we look at this. And again, it's important to recognize that a district that's experiencing a share loss in BEF does not necessarily mean that they will get less money through the formula. It really depends on what's happening in all the other districts. Is there more money coming into the formula to be able to offset that share loss? The next slide is just a snapshot. We've spent a lot of time putting together a model that we use with our school districts, allowing them to look at their share change and over time, try to figure out if they can identify trends and help them try to plan a little bit from year to year. The things that are in yellow are the things that school districts can adjust to be able to sort of get some benchmarks on where to start in the budget process. They can adjust their share from year to year. So if the trend has been it's going down, they can move it down and see what happens. They can put $100 million for next year, or $500 million, or zero for next year in terms of the additional state appropriation coming in. And so this model kind of moves us on to the next slide, which just gives us some examples of what this looks like for school district from year to year. So here's an example of Twin Valley School District. This is highlighting the increases in BEF that they have received each year. The formula with everything through 2023, actual data, and then again the everything on the right of that is just projected, which we can sort of ignore for this point. But this is really to show that here's an example of a school district. They had a huge share increase between 22, 23, 23, 24. So you can see the huge impact in additional BEF that drove out to this school district. They went from a $481,000 increase last year when there was a $525 million addition to BEF. This year, they got a $1.3 million increase with a 567. So in between that was a really big share increase for that district. Can they plan that will happen going forward? Is that share going to fall next year? I think that's the question that school districts grapple with. The flip side of that, another example on the next slide is Allentown School District, and we saw that they had a larger share decline this year. Again, you can see the impact of that share decline and the increase that they received for this fiscal year. So last year with $525 million, their increase was about $20 million. This year with $567 million, their increase is about $14.5 million. So again, that's really defined by that share loss in the formula. Again, they got more money despite that share loss, but it's really because there was additional funds put into that formula. The next slide is just our model sort of plots out share, so you can see the difference between, here's a smaller school district. You can see their share trend is up and down. Some years they increase, some years they decrease. Really not tremendously consistent trend. And the next slide shows the sort of impact of that over time. Again, they had that share loss from last year to this year, and so they got less money in terms of an increase this year with a larger amount added to BEF. The next slide is sort of the opposite school district from Forbes Road. Forbes Road is a small rural school district. Here's School District of Philadelphia. They've had a pretty consistent trend here, where there's been downward trend in their share for the past several years. And you can see on the next slide, you know, the impact of that as well, right? So here is their increase from year to year. You can see particularly from 22, 23 to 23, 24, that the impact of that share loss in terms of their increase there. So, you know, this is sort of how we go about trying to help school districts understand how the formula works and understand how their trends in share might impact them going forward. That brings us to our recommendations on the next slide. And we really, again, are looking at this from the lens of school districts need predictability. We want school districts to be able to budget over multiple fiscal years, sort of make thoughtful decisions about the programs, the staff, what they are implementing, whether or not they can effectively sustain that, how they can sustain it, what they need in terms of local revenue to be able to support those programs and staff and supports that they're putting in place. And so we think that there are a lot of ways that you could adjust relatively simply through the formula and make some beneficial predictability changes. One is to smooth the poverty percentages over 3 years through the formula. They are sort of it's a 5-year average now, but what we have seen is, particularly as we move through some of the COVID impacted data, it's certainly more volatile, I think, than anybody anticipated from when the commission originally put that data set in. And so trying to smooth that a little bit for districts by, again, doing a 3-year average would be, I think, beneficial. It would, again, mostly just protect the school districts at the top and bottom, and again, sort of smooth some of those peaks and troughs. You know, we sort of looked at this. It doesn't have a huge impact in sort of moving huge chunks of money. Most districts are relatively stable now, but there are a lot that aren't. So if we can just sort of adjust that, you do this with the 3-year average ADM. Special Ed Funding Commission a couple of years ago sort of changed that their Act 16 counts were smoothed over 3 years. So this is another opportunity to sort of make that a little bit more consistent for districts. The other recommendation is to fix the concentrated poverty cliff. You are either hit 30% and you get additional weights, or you don't. And every year, and we have a chart in the testimony, there are districts that newly qualify and then fall off of that cliff. And it is 5 to 15 districts that are impacted by this on an annual basis. The impact is significant. Some of those share losses we see are driven by districts falling off of that concentrated poverty cliff. So we're recommending, you know, there's a lot of different ways you could go about this. You can sort of do something that you're sort of creating that metric where you're sort of looking at your proximity to a certain threshold, or you're sort of holding districts at that level for an additional year if they fall off, giving them a year to sort of plan for the next year when they will definitely no longer qualify. So there's a lot of different ways we think you could go about that, but that is a huge impact for a lot of districts in the formula that really negatively impacts their share, and they can't predict what is going to happen. The difference between having a 29% acute poverty percentage and a 30%, there's no difference from a district's perspective. So that's something that we really think should be adjusted. Another recommendation is to exchange the charter weight for a charter reimbursement. the weight that is assigned to the charter school, number of charter school ADMs in the formula is 0.2. It's really, really small. We know that charter school tuition is one of those sort of school budget drivers in terms of expenditures. And so in the formula right now, that weight sort of moves about $32.5 million out of $2 billion. For most school districts that have 40 to 60 charter school students, it's paying for 3 to 5 of them. You could probably get a lot more bang for your buck if you took it out of a weight and put it into a reimbursement for school districts. That would be our recommendation. Move it there, make it a lot more effective in terms of actually responding to some of those costs that school districts have. And then another one of our recommendations is to sort of look at that local effort index in particular. We know that metric, particularly on the local effort side, is looking at local effort in comparison to all 500 school districts. But you're starting from where you're starting, and we're measuring based on the median. There can be districts that raise to the Act 1 index or above every year, and they're never, ever going to catch school districts at the sort of upper end. And so looking at that metric from a perspective of growth within a school district, maybe not instead of across all 499, would be a more effective way to measure that. Even to also think about how to consider something either within the formula or outside that looks at assessed value growth from year to year. Not every district has excess value growth. That's your taxable base. There are districts every year, about 20% of them, that have an assessed value decline. So they have to raise taxes just to get to level from year to year. And I think that's a dynamic that is sort of missed here that I think you could think through how to do that. And finally, I think our last recommendation is really to sort of adjust the balance between the stable base and the dynamic formula. And if you move ahead 2 slides to that one, yep, perfect. This sort of shows you how the value of a weighted ADM in the formula has grown over time. So this is basically the dollar amount value for every ADM at the end of the formula. We start at $52. It's now $754 per ADM. So every time your poverty increases, you're gaining $754. Every time your enrollment declines, you are losing $754. As you put more money on the dynamic side of this formula, that dollar amount goes up and up and up and up, and that balance between stable and dynamic from a predictability standpoint is really kind of lost. So if we go backwards 1 slide, just to give you the example of Sarah Area School District, this just shows you an example from this year. District last year, they had a $729,000 increase in BEF. This year, a larger amount added, they had a $27,000 increase. They could not have predicted that. They fell off a concentrated poverty cliff. You cannot build a thoughtful school district budget with this level of variation. And so looking at either sort of resetting the base or ensuring that you have from year to year a sort of cost of living adjustment, a minimum built in, I think would be really, really beneficial from school districts to ensure that they have more predictability in budgeting and are able to make thoughtful long-term decisions. And then finally, just a couple of other things that we wanted to add, highlight in the testimony. We would certainly caution against running all the money through the BEF formula. There are really significant implications for doing that for eventually all 500 school districts. The formula is not built to do that. That's a lot of dynamic money, and you have no predictability from a school district standpoint. Additionally, we would caution against putting all different formulas into one gigantic formula. One thing we know about this formula, again, it's really school district specific. It does a really good job at directing resources based on these factors. We have other formulas that do that as well. Special education does a great job of directing resources there. We've got, a transportation formula. We have others. And I think when you try to combine them all together, you're sort of diluting the value of each of those individual buckets to districts. Districts are different. Some do really well under special ed because that's their population. Some do really well under BEF, that's their population. For some, it is transportation. So combining them all really is not something we recommend. And then finally, the sort of balance between taxpayer equity, student equity, is an important distinction to make. Some school districts really need additional resources for their students. That is critical, and we know they don't have enough. Other school districts are relying a lot on local taxpayers to support their education program, and if we're providing additional resources to them, we want to make sure that that is taxpayer equity, right? Like, we're not providing that, or you want to make sure that you're not providing money for students that is then going back to taxpayers. They're two separate things. We think both are needed, but you don't want to accomplish both of those things through the same bucket of funding. And again, finally, again, increasing the state share across the board, really important, particularly in areas of mandated cost growth, special education, looking at this from a charter school perspective. Also ensuring that you're fixing the policy that is not allowing money to flow out, that money is, if you're going to put more money into education, it stays there. Right now, we have some policy, particularly with respect to charter school tuition and how that is calculated based on school districts' budgeted expenditures. If you put more money into education, into BEF, or into special ed, it is also flowing out then to these other areas. So if you want to put money in and you want to keep it within the school district and sort of ensure that those dollars can be used for the students there, you need to plug that hole and sort of before you're investing additional dollars. Again, we think having multiple buckets of state funding is really, really positive. That really reflects the needs of every individual school district. And I think, in the larger conversation of the school funding lawsuit, I think there's an opportunity to create a bucket that really focuses sort of like level up on ensuring you're sort of able to lift the bottom, lift those school districts that need the most support, and ensure that they have the resources while maintaining everything else and ensuring that everybody is able to move forward. So again, I appreciate the opportunity to testify today, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Barrick. I would like to note for the record that during Ms. Barrick's testimony, we have been joined by Senator Rothman and Senator Miller. And I will turn it over to Representative Isaacson for a question.
Gotcha. Okay. Hi, how are you?
Good,
Thank you very much for your testimony, especially for many people who might be watching. It was a very detailed discussion, and where I could have a long conversation with you regarding everything. One thing I do want to hit upon, considering the school district that I'm from in Philadelphia County, was your discussion about charter schools. And certainly cyber charter schools are an issue for many of the school districts around the entire Commonwealth. But in Philadelphia, we do have the largest amount of charter schools, and they are obviously, once you put this formula in place, they are, whether they need it or not, benefiting from the additional funding. So could you discuss a little more this concept of maybe something, maybe you're talking about something we used to do, which was a charter school reimbursement to school districts rather than them getting the weighted that the district has to deal with when they are in the regular public schools with this special needs, special education, and all the other factors that are a part of that formula that a charter school might not necessarily be having to deal with, but they are then financially getting that, and it kind of creates a little bit of an unequal system. And so maybe that is something that would significantly help if you could explain it a little more, and also touch upon cyber charter schools, because I do not think there is a school district here in the Commonwealth that does not have the burden of money flowing out to cyber charter schools that are not draining the brick and mortar.
Yep. Sure. And again, I think that's one of the really important things, from a big picture standpoint, before there's additional money sort of put into the system, you have to recognize that some of the money that's put in the system is sort of the system to school districts, right, is flowing out to charter schools. Again, charter schools get tuition. You want to make sure that they need the resources that they need to be able to educate those students. But, you're not actually, increasing the dollars to school districts in some cases, because everything you're putting in and more sometimes is going right back out to charter schools. So I think that's a balance, and one of the things that we had recommended as a result of that is recognizing that while there is a weight in the formula, it doesn't do a lot in the grand scheme of things. And so for some school districts, most school districts, it's paying for a handful of their charter school kids, not making a huge difference. So we used to have...
But not for mine.
Right, for yours, right. And even then, I mean, it's giving school districts $18,000, right? Their tuition is, $15,000, and they have 30 kids, right? So the idea of a reimbursement, something we used to have in Pennsylvania before. There's a lot of different ways you can do it. You can target it at brick and mortar. You can target it at cyber. You can target it all together, and you could do it really simply, like a sort of your share of the overall charter school students. We're going to design a pot of money, and you're going to get your sort of pro rata share. That would go a long way, much further for most districts than the formula weight does now. There's other ways you could do that too. You could sort of look at the growth from year to year, and the reimbursement could really be focusing on all or a percentage of that growth. That way school districts at least have predictability. We know that we are going to cover this piece of this cost, and if that expenditure grows, the state's going to support us in providing, X percentage going forward. There's a lot of different ways you can do it, but I think recognizing that is one of the major cost drivers for most school districts, doing something around that really preserves, the work that's being done to get additional dollars into school districts and to keep it there for those students.
And I appreciate your testimony. I mean, I can go on this topic for ages, considering we haven't changed the charter school law in 25 years. This might be a thought process with regard to the weight. But I'll turn it back over to you, and thank you for letting me have the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Recognize Senator Rothman for a question.
Thank you, Ms. Barrick. Thanks for your testimony, and both your written and your verbal testimony. But a couple questions about the formula. The household income is addressed, but in local taxes, there's a component of the residential local tax assessment, but also commercial and industrial. How is that factored in? When you look at a school district, do you look at it at its total tax base?
Right. So for the purposes of the formula, it's looking at a school district sort of total tax-related revenue. So everything you're getting from property taxes, that's predominantly what that's made up of in most school districts. It might be EIT, other things. So you're looking at that as a whole. And then you're sort of looking at based on the formula. The formula is sort of looking at that as a whole, and then we're kind of defining what is the burden on the individual or on households in that district. That's the metric that's kind of defined, ranking a school district above or below the state median based on that.
But the businesses and the commercial and industrial properties, they still pay the school taxes too.
Absolutely, yes.
So is that part of the formula?
I mean, the dollar amount that they're paying in the formula is part of, or that they're paying in property taxes is part of it. The metric itself is just defining the burden based on number of households. So it uses a metric from ACS data to pull that in. So it is looking at it, and just for comparison's sake.
Got it, but it does include that.
It does include that revenue, yep.
What about other, I mean, some school districts are eligible for federal funds. Is that part of the formula?
So federal funds come into this formula potentially, based on use. This is an area we know with respect to current expenditures. So I talked about in that local effort side, there is a metric that are you spending more than the state median or less. That current expenditures is sort of defined as dollars from whatever source, state, federal, local, that you're using in specific areas. So for generally instruction, operation support. If you're using federal funds, like if you're using your ESSER dollars for staff or things like that, they're going to fall into that category. It doesn't include things like facilities and debt service. So federal funds, depending on how you are using them, will come into this formula through that metric. And that's something I don't think I mentioned in the testimony, but that metric right now is probably really kind of wonky because of that. As the ESSER money kind of washes through, it will be a little bit more apples to apples comparison across.
And what was the total ESSER money in the last 3 years?
So the state got $5 billion. Well,
that was 1 year. The last year was $5 billion, right?
Yeah, it's
1, 3, 5. Does that sound about right?
It's somewhere about that. I don't think it was quite. I don't think schools received all of those dollars, or school districts. It was going to multiple school entities.
So, just a general business question about school district's budget. If it was a pie, clearly the largest expenditure is staff, right? What percentage of the pie goes to facilities? I mean, in looking at the 500 school districts that you work with, do they budget for facilities and maintenance?
Yeah, and I can share it with you after this. We sort of look at school district expenditures by object code over time, so we can sort of show you literally in a pie what school districts are spending on those areas. Again, in comparison to staff and salaries and benefits like that, it is a much smaller share, but we have seen some increases there certainly. Over time, we anticipate, with federal funds, with ESSER dollars, school districts are trying to use some of those dollars to engage in some of those, maintenance and school construction needs that they have had for a while that have not been funded. So it was an opportunity to kind of jump in a couple of areas.
Do you recommend to the school districts they should have a certain percentage set aside for facilities? And
I mean, every school district is different, right? So every school district.
Well, but as your association,
yeah.
do you do that?
I mean, again, every school district is different. They all have buildings that are in different sort of states of repair, ages. Everybody in most school districts have a capital reserve fund, and they have sort of careful, clear planning over time. These are the projects. These are dollars we need to set aside to be able to accommodate for that. It's been certainly really challenging without state reimbursement through PlanCon or some other program since that program's gone into moratorium. So it's really been on school districts, on taxpayers, and fortunately the ESSER funds have alleviated some of that, but it's temporary.
Speaking of reserves, is that included in the formula, how much reserves a school district has?
No. So, I mean, that's not part of this. We're sort of looking at, again,
the
metrics in that. I mean, I think the conversation about reserves really goes to the conversation about predictability from year to year. So, asking for a formula and overall school funding that is more predictable is really important for school districts. School districts, need to have reserves because there's a lack of predictability in what they're going to get. So not knowing if you're going to get $700,000 increase in BEF or $27,000 increase in BEF, that really defines the need for having a reserve that you can have on hand should you have a huge increase in special ed or some other situation.
Does the formula take in consideration, last question, sorry. Does the formula take in consideration the total number of school-age children in this school district?
It looks at the total number of students that are ADMs that the school district is financially responsible for. So that's all the kids that the school district is educating. It's all the kids that they're paying tuition for to go to a charter school or some other
So if
place.
a child lives in the school district, like the city of Harrisburg, but goes to a private school or a non-public school,
the school district is not financially responsible for those students. They're going to a sort of private placement special education, and the school
but
district is paying
the taxpayers are.
Right, and so that piece of it is included, in the total tax-related revenue and the local effort component.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Schweier for a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning. A little bit all over the place because your testimony was very comprehensive, and I appreciate you and the association's work since I've become chair and certainly well before that. I want to talk about the weights a little bit. One of the conversations that we've had both privately and in public have been the role of the weights and are they appropriate or not? Is a 0.3% English as a second language weight enough?
I mean, I think that's a good question. That weight was through the original commission process.
Sure, I'm not criticizing the original commission.
Yeah,
I'm just,
I think they looked at that based on a survey of school districts. It's been almost 10 years since that was done. I mean, I think that's a relevant question. Is that the appropriate weight based on what school districts are experiencing and those additional costs in that area?
Okay. I was going to ask similar questions about poverty and sparsity and those other sorts of things, but I'm guessing that your answer is going to be roughly the same. None of this is meant to be adversarial. Let's go back to the charter school conversation. Did you say $32 million is pushed out through the charter school reimbursement?
So if
in this weight, or I'm sorry, not reimbursement, but the
if you
weight.
sort of take the value of the weight the ADMs added, it equates to about that of the total sort of $2 billion pot.
How much money are school districts spending on charter schools across the Commonwealth?
About $3 billion.
Cool. So
32 million they get, and 3 billion is what it costs.
Correct.
So we could have the sort of wonky conversations about where they're factored in if it gets this. But really, at the end of the day, what we're talking about, I don't even know how many zeros is after the point. I'm not going to pretend, but we're talking $32 million out of $3 billion statewide.
Right. And so I do want to be clear that 32 million, I think it's 32.5 million, is just through the charter school weight, right?
Right.
Charter school students are included in ADMs throughout the formula. That's
Sure.
just in that weight piece. But yes,
Sure, but
32.5 out of $3 billion.
Understood.
approximately.
But so if hypothetically there's a school district that collects, say, $96 million a year in property taxes, and $74 million of which goes towards charter schools, I may live in that school district, that hypothetical school district. If we took all of the charter school reimbursement rate from every school district, including my dear friend to my right here physically, I did that for you, Mary, I could take all that money, I'm still losing $40 million a year.
Correct.
Cool. All right, thank you. So as you mentioned in your testimony that PASBO's position, and you're not the only statewide organization that has this as a policy position, or even, for lack of a better term, let's explore, let's flesh out the conversation, moving away from that weighted number to a reimbursement. Not a gotcha question, not setting up anybody. I think it was 30% before the cuts, right?
I think that was the goal. I don't think it got quite to that, but
Okay.
that was the goal.
Okay. What would the realistic goal look like? If we were to, if Anna was able to write what we're going to do on charter school reimbursement, and what would that, 100%, but outside of that, what would it realistically be?
I mean, I think, again, that there are multiple ways to do it, and any little bit would, I think, be beneficial to school districts. So we'll sort of start with that. You can do it really basic. You can do your pro rata share. You can put in a pot of money, sort of like BEF. It can grow from year to year. I think most effectively, from a sort of student equity side of things and as a taxpayer equity side of things, looking at that by, trying to control the growth from year to year. That way school districts know, I know here's what my charter school expenditure is going to be from year to year. I can cover this amount. But as it grows, that's where the state starts to sort of step in and take over a portion of that. So you're injecting predictability into the system from a school district perspective. You are, mitigating the extent to which you have to go to taxpayers from a school district to sort of cover all of that growth, because that's what's happening now once they exhaust their BEF and special ed and everything. And you're ensuring that more dollars are able to stay within the school district. So I think the philosophy of trying to look at that growth from year to year is beneficial, but at the same time, anything would help on that front.
Is there a risk in shifting over to, we're going to change the name of this commission to the Buckets Commission. Is there a risk of moving, and I'm just going to stay on charters, but this is really a question for all of the conversations, facilities, trauma-informed, all the stuff that we've talked about through the last 5 years. Is there a risk, and I, frankly, very candidly, a political risk, that we eliminate those buckets in the future as we have in the past?
I mean, I think from our perspective, the buckets are absolutely critical to making a school funding structure in Pennsylvania work for 500 school districts. We have everything from school district of Philadelphia to Austin area school district, right? And everything in between. Every school district is different. Some districts really need that Plan Com bucket. That is going to be critical. Some it's transportation, some it's PSER, some it's charter school, some it's special ed. We know that there's like 320 districts that dollar for dollar do better under the special ed formula than the BEF formula. So combining those things together really sort of, again, dilutes the value of each of those sort of individual needs by school district by kind of combining it. So from our perspective, multiple buckets is excellent, and I think there is real detriment to a lot of school districts if you sort of go the opposite direction.
Yeah, and the only pushback I'm going to say on that is, as somebody who's been around Harrisburg perhaps too long, some of my colleagues, in fact, probably most of my colleagues would suggest. I wasn't referring to you, Mary. My concern with that is that then it layers on sort of politics side on top of it? What is the particular area of concern for a future administration and a future legislature, not the wonderful 254 of us that are including the governor now, but some hypothetical, is somebody going to start devaluing something like pension obligations, which we've seen what has happened with that? Somebody going to start devaluing construction, those sorts of things, and start overemphasizing something else. That's my concern. If there's one, and I'm not saying I'm right, it's just a question of concern. If there's one giant pot of money that's run through a formula that gets us to the question of adequacy and equity, I don't want to lose sight of that, or at least, moves us closer to that direction. I think it's less likely that future political decisions will be made that will impact for lack of a better term, bucket, if that's fair.
I mean, I think from that perspective, I think we are just of a difference of opinion, and I think going.
And I'm not saying I'm right. That's why I want to flesh out the conversation.
I think going forward and into that larger conversation about the lawsuit, I mean, I think it's important to look at all of the buckets and look at them holistically to sort of define what is appropriate and what is the level of support. And I think through that lens, they all have to stay intact because they all serve a different purpose. They all sort of move a different lever for each group of school districts.
And we agree on that. Okay. So, all right, thank you. And I'm not to cut you off. I have some other things, but I don't want to monopolize your time. I appreciate it very much. I think it was very helpful. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative. Ms. Krug.
Thank you. Thanks, Hannah, for being here. So kind of throughout these hearings, we've touched on a wide range of issues, kind of gets to the buckets conversation again, which is great because it really informs us, it informs our work. We've discussed, mental health services, school counselors to transportation. At the end of the day, we have to update or develop a formula that is able to be implemented. It's based in data, to your point, that is reliable. So as we kind of think through some of these high-level issues that are affecting districts, can you offer some thoughts on how to distill and translate some of these big issues to, data points that, are reliable, transparent, predictable, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, from our perspective, like the BEF formula works really well as it is with the doing what it's supposed to do, looking at school districts with populations of students in greatest need, moving money there. I think thinking about all of these individual formulas that we have, right? We have a special education funding formula. It does a really good job, I think, of doing the same thing. Completely different set of factors, different purpose. That works. We have we had a plan-con system, and we have a sort of Act 70 at least provided an updated system, again, doing the same thing. There's a process there. I think, again, going back to the separate buckets thing, separate buckets are good for all of these pieces to sort of recognize the needs. I think as you're sort of looking at additional factors that, maybe potentially for a separate bucket or a different bucket, they have to be factors that are, again, verifiable, reliable. You have to have the data to be able to do that. Again, I think, and the trying to I'm flipping between the context of the BEF formula and all the other buckets that are out there. I think within the BEF formula, we think it works really well with the factors that are in it for the purpose that it is. If there's an idea of creating a separate formula, a separate bucket, I think our suggestion would be ensuring that you have, data that is tied to, reality. It is something that school districts have. They can collect it, they can report it, and preferably something that is already collected or reported in some way that is clear and concise and can be objectively reported, not subjectively reported by school districts.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful context. And I also wanted to, you mentioned how unique all of the factors are for each school district, how they interact and play with each other. As we're thinking about maybe looking at updates to weights or different changes to the existing formula, do you have suggestions on how to kind of isolate those changes when there are so many moving pieces for each specific district?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, again, and in some of the recommendations that we have modeled, so smoothing the poverty percentages, trying to infuse predictability in some of those ways. The formula, while it is complex, there's a lot of factors, it is actually pretty easy to kind of manipulate and model and sort of see what would happen if, what is the value of this, how do we impact a school district share overall in comparison and particularly going forward. required. So I think it's sort of easy to kind of test some of those things before we do it. And I think the other piece of this is really to sort of recognize the value of and the importance of the additional funds that are coming in. Again, as shares grow and shares decrease, and if you're going to modify anything in that formula, even the weights, you're changing shares. And so there will be 500 school districts that are impacted one way or the other. Making sure that is tied to an additional investment that sort of recognizes the impact of school districts from doing that. Again, that comes back to the dynamic formula piece, the stable base thing piece, and making sure that balance is more appropriate so that, again, we're not moving in the wrong direction in terms of predictability.
No, that's helpful. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Turning to Senator or Representative Topper. I almost gave you a promotion.
We all get paid the same. So many jokes. I'm not going to say any of them. There's too many senators around. But I will. Two questions, and one is this: I simply don't understand yet some of the local tax base stuff. So I want to try and understand that better. I think we all represent multiple schools. Most of us probably represent multiple school districts, or in Mary's case, certainly a very large school district. But if you have you have some school boards that say, look, we're going to take on this local effort. We're going to raise taxes, to the max every year because we want, that's what we want to do. And then you have some school districts who are like, we're never going to raise taxes. We're just going to, keep. So even though the populations might be the same, the local tax effort for the school district's different based on the school board philosophy. Is that, how does that factor in, or doesn't it factor in at all? That's what I'm trying to grasp with.
Yeah, so I mean, there's lots of layers to this conversation. So within the formula, one of the metrics or the data points that is used is your total tax-related revenue. For most districts, that is mostly property tax revenue. And so then we're sort of looking at that on a sort of per household, comparing you to the median. So there's a factor, that local effort factor is really kind of defining at a high level. Are you taxing more? Are you taxing less? Is the burden on your households more or less than the state median? The challenge with that, and the challenge across school districts, is school districts are starting from where they are starting. And so a school district that had boards 20 years ago and a philosophy where they weren't going to raise property taxes based on the dynamics at the time, if they decide now or last year or 10 years ago that they're going to raise to the index every year, they're never going to catch the districts at the other end of the spectrum that are 84% locally funded, because that's the balance. Again, the piece that comes into this that makes it very complex is the local share across districts ranges from like just above 10% to 84%. And so the importance of that local tax base over time is really very diverse across districts, and it's really hard to move that metric. So when you look at some of the data in the formula, that local effort factor, some of those school districts that have a factor that's below that sort of state median number or lower than 1, some of that's because they might have had a philosophy. They might not be, adding, millage rate increases on an annual basis. It might be that they have, a really, really minimal tax base from which to sort of even move. It might be that they just are never going to catch here, the folks in southeastern PA that are most reliant on local revenue. So I think that's one of our recommendations is really to try to, how do we look at that a little bit differently and try to identify the value of those districts that have really started to sort of recognize that there's a local share component of our overall school funding system.
Because some of those districts might have access to the tax base. They're just not accessing it because they're not. And then you have some districts that really don't have access to the tax base, but they're having to, hammer the index every time because that's their only option. So I'm trying to get a hold of that idea of what do we incentivize for our school districts? Like, what are we trying to capture through the formula, through the local share conversation?
So the formula, again, the local effort multiplier, again, greater than 1, less than 1. For a school district, mathematically, if it's greater than 1, right, it's going to make your number that you started with bigger. So if you're below the median on the sort of tax burden, it is shrinking you down. So from that perspective, I guess the formula sort of incents like, a share in this, right? There's a local share, and that as your school district is adding additional taxes and support, that is theoretically moving your number up. At the same time, there's that current expenditure per weighted student that's sort of recognizing the opposite of that. So we don't want to incentivize high taxing for the purpose of spending way above the state median per student. So on that side, it's pulling it down. So there's sort of both of those pieces. I think our challenge is you can be a school district that is under that median, and you can tax as much as you want, but it's going to be really hard at this point in time to kind of move the needle for you and be able to make that distinction between districts that are adding additional taxes and districts that are not.
And then the one bucket on my last question that I want to address is one that we don't talk about a lot, but it's the PSERS. I mean, it's in the back of our mind. We don't like to think about it, but the idea of that is one bucket that you and your folks with business officials in the schools, that is one bucket that we could potentially make a one-time investment in and really clean it up. I think if we went into like an unfunded, if we went to each, as the state, if we took that on and said we're going to take $1 billion off of that, what would that look like? Or is that something that, again, over time just needs to be funded at the current level until we get it? What are your thoughts of how we could deal with PSERS?
I think there's a couple ways you can attack it. By putting money in to try to deal with the unfunded, like you can't put enough money into that to really sort of make a difference at the local level. But what you could do is you could increase the share that the state is providing to school districts now, to sort of the reimbursement percentage. That would be really effective in providing school districts with relief on that side, versus try to kind of tackle some of that unfunded liability and kind of pay that off. That's really hard to do, to move the needle on over time. But again, in the short term, increasing the reimbursement to school districts, would be legitimately beneficial in trying to provide some relief on that front.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative. Turn it over to Senator Williams online.
Chairwoman. Thank you, Hannah, for being here. My first question goes a little off of where Rep. Topper was asking at the beginning. How, if at all, does the formula account for the amount of non-taxable land in a school district?
So the formula doesn't. It's looking at your total tax-related revenue. So what you are not taxing is not included in the formula in any way.
Okay, because we've had some districts testify about their percentage that is owned by like the UPMCs of the world, and how that percentage, how they can't raise taxes in one area because they just can't do that.
And I think that goes to that assessed value questions. There are the tax base is important. The tax base in every district looks really different, and so some districts are in a much easier position than others, particularly if they are more reliant on local revenue.
Thank you. Following up on Rep. Schweier's question and your testimony, you cautioned against combining existing formulas, and I understand your point there. But can you talk about how all of these funds are connected and that they all impact getting to adequacy? And we've had some other testifiers talk about how a school district, if they don't have enough in their base, they're stealing. Like if they don't have enough, if their special ed costs, for instance, are too high, they're going to steal from their base to pay, steal from Peter to pay Paul. Can you talk a little bit about that impact on districts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, the sort of from a really broad perspective, looking at the overall state share is really important. We talk a lot about BEF because that's the flexible bucket of money, right? Those dollars can be used for special ed or PlanCon or whatever you want, or school construction, whatever you want to use those for. The goal is to keep them within the district and use them for programs as you need them. But what we know from a lot of districts is the increases that are added to BEF are just going over to cover special education because the state share there is really, really low, not keeping pace with expenditures from a school district side, or they're sort of going out to pay for charter school tuition. So I think as you look at all of the buckets, together, it's important to sort of adjust all of them to sort of have the best situation, making sure that the state share is appropriate, particularly like special education is one, where we are looking at those areas that are expenditures and that are driving school district cost. Special ed is like one of those number one items, and the state share is really, really low there. We want to put money in so that school districts can use those dollars instead of pulling from other buckets or relying on local property taxes. Again, you talked about PSERS. You could increase the state reimbursement there, and that would also ensure that dollars for PSERS are there. You don't have to go necessarily to other buckets or to local taxpayers. You create a charter school bucket, you can do the same thing there. And again, with BEF, making sure that you can put in place some additional adjustments to ensure predictability. Once you've if you can do all of those things, I think you create a lot more predictable system, and you create a system that now you can have that bigger conversation and ensure that dollars you're putting in are being used in the way that you want them to be used, right? For schools, for programs, sustainable, supports, et cetera.
Thank you so much. I've seen that reflected in what is happening in my area and frankly all across the state. My last question, on page 2 of your written testimony, towards the bottom of the page, second to last paragraph, last sentence, for other periods of time, all school districts received inflationary adjustments to account for the cost of living, in parentheses, the 2014-2015 base has not been adjusted for inflation. If it had, it would approximate the BEF formula increases over the past 9 years. Am I understanding correctly that you're saying that these quote unquote historic increases that we've seen over the last couple of years just about equal inflation in that base amount?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Miller.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just one quick question on adequacy targets. We know the court ruling. I talked about that, and Dr. Kelly's testimony. How crucial do you think that is for this commission to take that into account, finding a sufficient target, and then potentially putting new dollars into reaching those targets?
I mean, I think the focus on looking at basic education, making sure that there are adjustments that can be made to the formula that is in place right now, making sure that that is more predictable, looking at the other buckets and sort of ensuring that the funding system that we have in place currently is sort of adjusted. I think once you can sort of deal with some of those things and acknowledge some of those things and then sort of think through some of those items, I think that allows you to have a larger conversation. I know obviously the school funding lawsuit and the decision there talked about additional dollars and adequacy and equity and other policy adjustments as well that are certainly necessary. I think that's one component of a larger conversation. And again, like we keep talking about buckets, like I think you could do that through a bucket potentially that was really intended to lift the bottom, look at everybody sort of across the board and ensure that you're able to move up those folks that are furthest behind. But I think, again, looking at that entire system is important. Step one is really to look at, okay, what can we do with the BEF formula? What adjustments are needed there to ensure that we've got predictability and we're sort of set to be able to use any sort of next steps and additional dollars in a way that is most valuable and beneficial to students and schools.
Yeah, and I think one thing that we definitely saw in the testimony from a couple different hearings is that new dollars are definitely needed to get towards adequacy. Do you agree with that?
I think across the board, new dollars are needed, additional dollars. The state share really needs to be a little bit different for all 500 school districts, whether it's on the student equity side of things or it's on the taxpayer equity side of things. I think that's true across the board.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Sturla.
Thanks. I want to touch on several things here. Your second slide talked about the percentages of, what the BEF formula is and isn't, and the stable base, that's the part that was the old funding formula, correct?
That's generally what school districts were receiving in 2014-15, plus if you were a level up district in the past, that gets folded into there, and some other adjustments that were made individually as well.
Okay, but that base formula was what was considered the least equitable in the entire United States, and if you included the District of Columbia, we rated 51st.
I mean, that formula, or that base, again, is sort of made up of, we had years where we had a formula that drove money out through different factors. We had years where it was just inflationary adjustments. It was back and forth. It was everything. But I think going forward, yeah, it is the piece that school districts can kind of rely on as the stable part of that subsidy.
Okay. So if we change the base and the formula by which we devise that base, but we still said that's your stable amount, come hell or high water, does that give school districts the stability that they need, knowing that it's not going to change, but that it's based on something fairer than 51st?
I mean, I think for school districts, because if you adjust that base and you sort of reset it, right, we're going to lock in all the improvements, the additional dollars that school districts receive through the 9 years of the formula. We're going to ensure that those districts that are receiving minimal amounts at least aren't sort of going backwards from year to year. They at least have, locked in some additional capacity for cost of living adjustments. Again, that Sarah Area School District is a good example. And you're also ensuring, again, that you've got that balance between the stable and dynamic piece. That dynamic piece is really dynamic now. From school district budgeting, you can't make good decisions, because you have no idea if you're getting $700,000, $27,000, or less than you got before. So I think that is a good, from a school district budgeting perspective, a good tool that would benefit 500 school districts is going forward.
Okay. So, but I guess what I'm like, let's say in an ideal world that we're going to get some adequacy dollars and we're going to put them in over the next 5 years. And let's say in year one, we're going to, come to realize that we got to put a significant amount of money in, or the courts are going to come back in and tell us that we got to put even more in. And let's say, for example, we say we're going to put an additional $2 billion into education into that new part of the funding formula next year. Isn't that the best time to adjust the base? Because I can ensure that no school district gets less than they did the prior year, while I adjust the base to make that base fairer, versus keeping the 51st worst in the nation base, and then saying, and we're going to add $2 billion to that, and you'll still get some of that, even though the majority of the money is still over in that 51st worst base. Can I get it to it would be the 35th worst base, and still put the $2 billion in the new amount of money, and have no school district lose a cent, but not have them continue to get increases based on the worst formula in the nation?
So I think from that perspective, the larger conversation, I think it's important to kind of look at this, at least we look at this from we're not looking just at BEF, right? If you're going to infuse additional dollars, sure, BEF is a place to put them, but you got to put them in special ed. You have to put them in other places. And if you want to create a separate bucket to be able to lift the bottom, that's a really good way to do it. That way you're not sort of again, diluting the value. You put it all in BEF, you're missing those 320 school districts that do better dollar for dollar under special ed. So I think the idea of sort of treating BEF as the sort of the answer to this larger problem is, I think, something that we would not recommend. I think, you can do an infusion. There's a lot of places to put it. And again, if you specifically define a bucket for that purpose, I think that makes a lot more sense. And again, we're looking at through the lens of predictability and stability and sustainability for school districts. That's what they need to make thoughtful decisions. That's what they need to sustain programs. That's what they need to make sure that balance with the local taxpayers is also appropriate and planned over time.
Okay. You touched a little bit on charters in particular, and said 32 million of the 0.2, and even if I say, yeah, but you got the 1.2 basically times that, you're still only at like, I forget what the number is I calculated, $200 million that the school districts are getting. And even if you say, hey, yeah, but the school districts supply 70% of the money and we only supply 30% of the money, I'm still only getting to like $700 million, and you got a $3 billion price tag. So that's just money that is, so when we talk about charters, people always go, well, yeah, but see, you can save money. It is a $2 billion suck of money off of what schools have to educate kids. Do we need to, and you talked about at least stopping the bleeding, do we need to not just stop the bleeding, but maybe go back in and look at how we're doing that funding? I mean, estimate is that in special ed alone, that we overfund special ed to charters by about $600 million a year. I mean, if we're trying to figure out where we come up with the money to do what we need to do, don't we first figure out, like, stop spending in places where it shouldn't be going?
I mean, I certainly that has been an ongoing conversation for almost 20 years, and trying to adjust that because, again, what happens is charter school tuition is based on school district budgeted expenditures. They go up, there's more money. Like it's a cycle that just continues on. I think, it's also a really challenging conversation. We haven't made a lot of progress over 20 years in adjusting it. So I think, the idea of a reimbursement really kind of takes some of that challenge out and provides like meaningful support to school districts. It also ensures that the charter schools have the resources that they need. They're educating 170,000 kids. Like, they need the resources to do that too. I think, but I do think that there still is that issue that you would want to address, that dollars into the system don't necessarily mean dollars. And again, defining the system as school districts don't necessarily mean dollars are reaching, students in classrooms unless you adjust some of that other policy. So sort of two pieces of that. There are ways to certainly provide relief. I think for school district, any relief would be really beneficial.
Okay. Two other quick questions, if I could. Dr. Matt Kelly, the first person that testified, you talked about adequacy, talked about one of the components, the poverty component, and that the way we calculate poverty right now is based on census tracts, and that there's a better way to do it based on the actual wealth of the children, not the census tract that they come from. And I see this happening in my district, where in a really impoverished census tract, there is currently a condo building being built that's going to have about 300 condos that are going to start at $500,000 apiece. The kids from that census tract, which are making parents are making less than $30,000 a year, are now not going to get credited to the school district as kids in poverty, because the average wealth in that census tract is skyrocketing. It's the old Oprah walks into a bar. Didn't change what everybody else's income was, but the median income in that district just went, or that bar went, whoo-hoo, So that's happening all across the state. So what is the best way that we can? Do you agree with Dr. Kelly that we should change the way we do that, because it's not really reflective of the way we currently do it?
Yeah, so I mean, I put a little bit in the testimony when talking about the poverty weights and how they were defined originally and why the census data was used. The where we are right now too, I think there are certainly differences between the economic disadvantage data as well as the ACS data. Again, the ACS data, it's a 5-year average, but it's an annual survey that's done, small sample size, to individuals living in each school district. That comes back, and again, there's a lag, but it's a 5-year average. It was used because in the formula there was an identification and a difference between acute poverty and poverty. The economic disadvantage data is one metric, right? So you can't really translate this without sort of looking at specifics for every single student and potentially additional reporting to kind of define that to individual weights. So I don't know how they sort of translate. I agree, they're very different metrics, and they look really different across school districts. They're measuring different things, so I think that's a component of it. They're not meant to be the same. They shouldn't be the same. They're completely different data points. I mean, I think it would be really looking at how you could put economically disadvantaged data into the formula would be really hard, again, because you're translating one data point to two data points. You'd almost have to use the ACS data anyways to sort of define the ratio of acute poverty to sort of poverty. So I think that creates a challenge. But I think if there's something else that is being, developed, I think, it measures something different than what the formula is measuring.
Okay. One final question, if I could. Facilities. I did a back-of-the-napkin calculation the other day because we learned that there's 3,922 total facilities in the state of Pennsylvania that schools operate. And so if I was going to do a 100-year plan and make sure that buildings got replaced, each building got replaced at least once every 100 years, which I think is a reasonable thing. Building has a life of 100 years if you renovate it 2 times in between. But just to replace those buildings over a 100-year period, I'd have to be doing 39.2 buildings a year. And when I look at the cost of school facilities, on average, I got a $100 million high school, I got a $35 million grade school, I got a $50 million middle school, I got a $5 million administrative building, but I'm going to spend about $50 million a piece on those buildings. Times 39 schools is I got to spend like $1.5 to $2 billion a year. What are we looking at in terms of Plan Con dollars to help school districts do $2 billion worth of construction statewide a year for the next 100 years?
So I agree. I mean, we need funding for school facilities. That's something that when the Plan Con dollars went away, that is 100% on school districts, taxpayers to be able to fund, and we know some districts can and some districts can't. I think one thing that, again, has sort of provided some very needed relief for some districts is the ESSER funds that, again, some were able to use those for upgrades, maintenance, and some for larger projects that they wouldn't have been able to do without those funds. But again, those are time limited. Those are coming to the end. I think the challenge is trying to understand what the scope is on that and trying to understand what that input of ESSER funds really did and what that allowed school districts to sort of improve. I think, one really good opportunity to sort of look at school districts and sort of understand what their needs are, where they are right now, and what they're looking at. But again, that state support coming back in to at least provide reimbursement for the big projects, for even the small projects, is absolutely critical, particularly as we are in the space we're in with interest rates being as high as they are. That support is very much needed.
Do schools have those individual school district plans for their facilities, and do they share that with the state? And can we compile sort of statewide what our needs are? Because I'm doing a back-of-the-napkin thing. I'd love to have real data. Is it available?
I mean, I think I don't think that's not information that is sort of shared with the state, but every school district has at least here's how what we need to do. Here's what's on our ticket list to be able to move forward over a period of time. That probably doesn't include those major projects, and certainly it's not it's as complex as a sort of overarching facility study, but. I think that would be something that would be valuable for certainly the state to have to sort of understand what the scope of the need is.
Okay.
It's probably significant.
Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Thank you. And I would like to note that while all of this has been going on, the good gentleman from Philadelphia, Senator Hughes, has joined us. Senator Hughes, questions?
Thank you very much. Just a question and a brief comment. Having served on the Plan Con Commission, I guess it was 5 or 6 years ago, that was one of the issues that we tried to figure out how to get our arms around, and we're not successful in terms of trying to figure out what the total capacity is or what the need is across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Given how many of us started off our school year having to deal with, and it's been said in previous conversations here, having been said, many of us had to deal with school closings because of heat issues and ventilation and things of that nature. At some point, I think we are obligated to to put some extra time into that space, because we can come up with the best formula, be constitutional, be adequate, meet the judge's demands, but if the buildings can't open because there's asbestos, lead, very tragic issues, which I know you're familiar with, or they can't open because it's too hot or too cold and they can't comply, kids are not getting class time. Students are not getting class time. To correct myself, Dr. Clayton, whose funeral service is today, the first African-American woman to serve as the superintendent of Philadelphia School District, always reminded us to always talk about them as students, not as kids, all right? But these students can't get instruction because they're not in a school. And we know that technology is an option to provide, but it really is not sufficient to do the job necessary. So I would just suggest, Madam Chair, Mr. Chair, and to the whole commission that we, at some point, we got to figure out a way around that particular issue, because I think it's absolutely necessary. Given the age of the school infrastructure in Pennsylvania, Plan Con has historically been in place, but is that the best way? Maybe we need to come up with something else, but it's got to be addressed. So thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator. And if I could wrap this up, I just want to go back. We've had conversations about adequacy. Dr. Kelly, some of the previous testifiers have proposed using a version of the old formula for adequacy that was developed, I think, about 20 years ago. Why have you not included that approach in your recommendations to this committee?
I mean, I think we were asked to come here today to talk about BEF formula and talk about, what recommendations we could have sort of to start with sort of making the formula better. I think there, in the larger conversation about buckets, I think it makes sense that you could create a bucket, to be able to accomplish a lot of the sort of direction that I think is set forth and is certainly needed through the decision of the lawsuit.
So you don't believe then that adequacy formula is viable. You instead believe that adequacy should be part of basic education and put it in a bucket?
So I think we need to maintain the formulas that we have, right? We need to maintain basic education. It provides a really valuable, sort of support and resource for school districts. Like we need to maintain special ed and PSERS and transportation, and we need to fund PlanCon. I think being able to address the larger issues, and be able to move forward with the school funding lawsuit is looking at all of that holistically, and sort of looking at how you lift the bottom through potentially a separate bucket that really targets those districts that are sort of furthest behind, most in need of support, in conjunction with everything else, so that you're still providing BEF resources to districts based on their needs, and SEF resources based on their needs as well.
Okay. So to sum up what you've said, it needs to be predictable, it needs to be stable, it needs to be sustainable. Things have changed since the last Basic Education Funding Commission formula was enacted 9 years ago. The number of students has declined, the number of students living in poverty has declined, and the amount of money that's been put into the formula has increased.
And again, overall, the percentages of the students living in poverty have declined. That is, again, the experience in each individual school district is really different.
And so what does that impact on how we move forward?
So, I mean, I think, recognizing the formula is where it is, again, and sort of understanding the predictability and that balance makes it really difficult for districts to sort of effectively budget from year to year, know what they're going to get and be able to plan for that. Again, I think the recommendations that we've set out, being able to smooth the base, get rid of the concentrated poverty cliff, make a decision about the charter school weight, but really look at, again, that the dynamic nature and making sure that it's a valuable resource for school districts. They have an idea what they're going to get next year and the next couple of years. They're not surprised. They can make decisions with the use of those funds about whether or not they can hire staff and sustain them, whether or not they can add a program and sustain it. I think it's important to look at the formula through that lens, because we're in a really different place than we were in 2015-16 when that formula went into effect. We've got $2 billion moving through it. The formula works really well, but that dynamic component is a little bit more dynamic than we, I think, realized collectively back in 2015-16. And I think there's adjustments that can be made to sort of mitigate that, but to also ensure that we're moving forward, providing districts with additional supports.
With more predictability.
More predictability.
Okay.
And again, recognizing it's not just BEF. There's, other places, too, that you want to be able to focus on.
Right.
Big picture.
So you've cautioned us, don't put everything together. I know special ed gives me a lot. I have great reservation about merging that in and losing that perspective because of how important those dollars are. And then you talked about something that we really haven't heard much about previously, and that is, a lot about student equity. We've heard a lot about student equity, but what we haven't really heard about is that taxpayer equity component. And in your testimony on page 36 of 38, you talked about how taxpayer equity should be accomplished through a different mechanism, right? You talked about that specific bucket of funds directed to property tax relief in districts with the greatest burden and/or targeted state efforts to begin to cover the growth in mandated expenditures from year to year.
Right.
You said it's critical. Property tax relief is essential, but it also matters how we provide that relief. So can you expand on what you think that is going to look like?
So it could look like a lot of things. And again, I think, the caution here in understanding that student equity and taxpayer equity are very interconnected, but sort of need to sort of remain siloed, really comes from the fact that we have, again, 500 school districts. We have a local share that is 11% to 84%. And, when you are talking about additional state support and having those conversations, you really have to make the distinction. Is that additional state support really going to ensure that students are getting, additional supports and services and staff? Or is that additional state support going to a district that's really relying on local funding? And so that really is functioning as taxpayer relief. Both of those things are important, and both of those things are necessary, but you don't want to put a ton of money into BEF, and some districts are using it for student equity in their schools and making sure their students have what they need, and other districts are passing it through to their school, to their taxpayers. We want to provide relief to taxpayers. I think that is an important part of this conversation, and the system that we have is really inequitable on that side as well. But I think you want to make sure that you are doing that distinctly in a bucket that is for property tax relief. If you have hours to talk, we have a proposal that really looks at how you can provide sort of sustainable state funding, but also look at the impacts on taxpayers and provide relief to homesteads as well as to all taxpayers, including businesses. There's ways to do that. But I think even more simplistically, working to look at those areas that are driving school district budgets and being able to invest additional state resources there. Now you're doing two things. You're ensuring that the dollars you're putting in the system stay in the system and they're not, going to PCERs and things like that. But you're also making sure that you're controlling that growth from year to year for school districts, so they don't have to go to their local property tax base to sort of fund those those increases from year to year. So there's a bunch of different ways that you could do it. But I think our caution is really to recognize that they're separate. It is not, you can't sort of accomplish all of that by putting more money into BEF. You're doing two things, and you're doing two things that you want to maintain and sort of silo off a little bit.
I appreciate that. And you have been incredibly gracious with your time. We're approaching the 2-hour mark of you sitting in that chair. I think this has been a really robust, very helpful conversation. Yes, we want to continue to have that conversation because we know that in that decision, they talked not only about how much money, but they talked about how that money gets into the system and how that money is distributed through the system. So I think it's going to be an important part of the conversation, and I want to thank you profusely for your testimony and your time today.
Okay, thank you for having me.
So with that, I would like to call up our next panel representing the Pennsylvania Association of School Administrators. And that panel includes Dr. Sherri Smith, and she serves as the association's executive director, Dr. Jay Burkhart, who is the superintendent of Southwestern School District and our very gracious host here today of this commission's meeting, and Dr. Nathan Van Deusen, who is the superintendent of Southeastern School District. And both of our superintendents, I should note, also serve or have served in leadership positions within the Pennsylvania Association of School Administrators. So welcome. We're thrilled to have you here today. And before we begin, I'm going to need to swear you in. If you could please rise, raise your right hands. And do you swear that the testimony that you're about to provide here today is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. And if so, please indicate by saying, I do.
I do.
Thank you again. And I'd like to have all three of you testify, and then we will take questions from our members. Dr. Smith, when you are ready, please begin.
Thank you, Senator. Sorry. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having PASA here today, as well as our two representatives, to talk about a critical issue that you have in front of you. And honestly, it's a really difficult issue, but probably one that makes the biggest difference for our schools over the next few decades. So appreciate your efforts and your opportunity to come together and talk about this. So the purpose of this commission is to revamp a school funding system that provides for both adequate and equitable school funding and delivers on the need to provide all students a thorough and efficient education regardless of their zip code. Pennsylvania's 500 school districts are all characteristically unique. Developing an equitable funding program that controls these variances is highly complex and creates many challenges to effectively address equity and funding of our schools, and ultimately provide for the equity of opportunities for all our students. However, it's critical of the work of this commission that we accomplish this goal. Because of these complexities and to ensure equity is achieved, having multiple funding sources is recommended. To try and encompass all the metrics needed to ensure equity under one set bucket of dollars, such as the basic education formula, would be unmanageable and create other unintended inequities if attempted to do so. Funding allocations for special education programs and services, major facility renovation and maintenance projects, and transportation should all be provided separate from the basic education formula. There is a critical need to address the increasing costs of special education through the special education formula. Special education is one of the fastest growing cost drivers to school districts due to continued increase in number of students who require special education services, the number of specialized services our students need, the costly legal fees incurred from Pennsylvania's special education due process procedures, and the supply and demand needs of staffing special education classrooms and services. Between IDA federal funding and the SEF state funding, districts are only receiving 25% of the funds needed to address their overall special education costs. That means districts are redirecting more and more of their BF dollars to address the costs specific to special education. This, in turn, creates tighter budgets that would be used to provide needed opportunities for students served in other programs and classrooms, causing another concern for ensuring equitable opportunities for all students. Funneling significantly increased funding through the special education formula is highly recommended to assist in resolving equity in our schools. Another funding bucket that needs to be reinstituted is one for school facility renovations and upgrades. The environment that students are educated in is critical to their emotional and physical well-being. Some of our schools are in such disrepair that it is not reasonable to think that it is a safe space for our students, much less conducive to learning. If you want equity for our students, without a doubt, we need to put money into ensuring all of our students have the benefit of a safe, healthy, and inviting learning environment. When our school leaders are asked what is the most important to them in education funding, they are most concerned with the predictability and sustainability in funds. They want to know that the state-provided funds are fair to everyone and benefit all students in all school districts. It's also critical that the funding formulas are based on known, reliable, and verifiable data and formula components. School leaders need an understandable formula that allows them to estimate the future impact of their local decisions. PASA strongly supports the continued use of the basic education funding formula to distribute new basic education funds going forward. PASA believes the formula, combined with an increased state investment, provides the best pathway forward to correct the disparities in funding among school districts. The BEF formula directs money to school districts based on objective factors such as student enrollment, the needs of students enrolled in school districts, population sparsity, school district wealth, and capacity to raise local revenues. However, a review of the metrics in the formula is recommended to provide our school districts greater predictability of funding by smoothing out some of the high and low variances in payments from year to year. PASA encourages the Commission to reference back to PASBO's testimony on those recommendations, such as adjustments to the poverty percentages by using multiple years of data. We also question the need to increase the impact of the sparsity size adjustment that provides for the slight adjustment in ADMs for Pennsylvania's schools with the largest geographical area and are sparsely populated, our small rural schools. Students in these schools are often remiss from receiving the varied opportunities that students in larger school districts receive. Even the digital infrastructure and connectivity are a challenge for these communities, a factor to be reviewed and considered. Maintaining the stable base of BEF subsidy is necessary to not create other unintended consequences and inequities in funding. The base represents 75% of the BEF funds schools currently receive and reflects the total BEF subsidy schools received in the 2014-15 formula. This base is important to maintain the stability of funds for schools and should not be rolled into the newer, more dynamic formula. Instead, it is recommended that the Commission targets additional funding of those schools found to be underfunded in the BEF base funding to correct the inequities, a concept similar to that of Level Up, but to be inclusive of all schools underfunded, not just the bottom 100. It is important that any state increases in BEF funds directly benefit the students who attend those schools and not flow back out to fund other mandated costs. The biggest cost drivers for flow-through of dollars goes to the increasing costs of PESR's retirement system and the funding of charter schools. By example, the state increased district funding over a 10-year period from 2010-11 to 2020-21 by $2.8 billion. However, the PESR's increases and the charter tuition cost increases, a combined cost of $5.3 billion, put districts $2.5 billion in the red and in a difficult situation to either increase local taxes or cut district programs for students. How do we control the costs of these mandates so that the state increased funding actually benefits the students who attend these schools? These concerns are a critical part of resolving the funding for our schools and equitable opportunities for our students. Beyond providing for additional funding and controlled mandated costs that take needed dollars from the instruction of our students, PASA offers a few other considerations for improving funding inequities and ultimately opportunities for students. There's a growing trend both at the state level and federal level to provide funds to schools through our grant application process. This trend creates many additional hours of school staff time to complete and comply with each of the grant's requirements. In some cases, the districts must hire additional staff to manage the number and types of grants. It also causes inequity in the types of schools that have the personnel and knowledge to effectively apply for the dollars, creating an outcome that some of our most challenged districts are not able to apply or do not actually receive the funds. Pooling these dollars into our process, as used in the annual Ready to Learn grants, would create greater opportunity and efficiency for schools to obtain the funds and ultimately more effectively and efficiently provide the programs mandated to support our students. The state would also be able to receive data on how each district implemented their programs and outcomes through such a system. Additionally, collaborative work among schools is encouraged to provide additional opportunities for students. With the use of modern-day technologies, sharing instructional staff and classes across districts will assist in personalized instruction for our students. In closing, the question we need to ask first is, what are the needs and specific targets we must provide for all students in the Commonwealth to ensure equitable opportunities for all students. Once we know what the programmatic targets are, then determining the needed funding to address and achieve the targets becomes more manageable in both concept and delivery. There's an opportunity to correct the inequities our students experience based on the location of their schools. I'm thrilled to have this commission come together to take a look at this, and I'll pass it to my colleagues before we open for questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Smith. Dr. Burkhart.
Thank you. Good morning, and I can still say that because we have a minute left. Chair Sterla, Chair Phillips-Hill, and members of the Basic Education Funding Commission. I'd like to welcome you to our, and my colleagues to our beautiful school district. Not on? Should I start over? Okay. To our beautiful school district, and thank you for taking the time to come and speak about this topic. It is truly an honor to have everyone here today. I'm Jay Burkhart. I'm superintendent of this wonderful district, and on behalf of our Board of School Directors, students, staff, and community, it is truly a privilege to speak with you today. I would like to take a few minutes and talk with you about the basic education funding formula and the role it plays here in Southwestern School District. I want to begin by telling a story or asking you to imagine that all of the chairs here today are interconnected in a similar string, almost like a spider web. The string is tight, and the chairs in some way are connected to another. Given the connections between the chairs, if we attempt to move even one, it will directly impact another chair, whether that is our intention or not. And as you attempt to move one chair, another chair moves and a ripple effect continues. You also may try to move one chair but are unable to due to its connection. At this point you may be saying, what in the world does this have to do with education, Jay? The example is saying that the interconnection between the chairs has to do with our basic education funding. The strings represent the connections between the program and the funding that we receive through our BEF. It's tight, like most, if not every school district, and the fiscal challenges they face every day. The chairs represent the programs that may have to be adjusted that my colleague talked about with the limited funding that may result. If a program is adequately funded or not funded at all but must be offered, districts have to look for funding in their budget. If we reduce or modify a program, the impact would undoubtedly be felt in other areas. The two areas I would like to address here at Southwestern today are staffing and charter school funding. I recognize that some of my discussion points may be beyond the scope of BEF. However, as my colleagues have pointed out, if BEF is adequately funded, it presents an opportunity for districts to have some flexibility funding other programs that otherwise would take dollars away. The first example I will share is staffing. Our district has seen an increase in the number of positions needed for paraprofessionals in our district over the last several years. In addition to the increase in the number of positions, which carries a significant cost, our district has also had to increase starting wages to attract and retain the talent to fill these very important positions in our classrooms. Some of the positions were needed due to increased student enrollment with special needs, and others were due to the increase in hourly wages to retain our very important and talented employees. The resulting expenses are both immediate and carry long-lasting and compounding effects to our budget. I'd like to share with you our budgetary expenses for our paraprofessionals over the last several years. Beginning in 2022 and 23, we saw an increase of $834,844. 23-24, where we are currently, we have a $931,332 increase above and beyond what we had the previous, and our school year of 24-25 is projected to reach over $1 million. As mentioned many times by districts, the increased costs are due to pressures outside of our control and speak to the importance of the people who do the job to better educate our students. Wages have been increased so we can continue to attract qualified candidates to our position. This continued need must be addressed, and as you can imagine, when we fund these additional costs, the string of that chair pulls on other areas. The money must come from somewhere. A second area of cost that continues to increase in our budget and impact our district budget is that of charter schools. These costs have dramatically increased over the past several years. Our district, like others, have worked to contain these costs by partnering with our local IU to provide an online earning option that for our students. The option we provide to our students here is called Lincoln Edge. Lincoln Edge, as of today, has 83 students from the Southwestern School District on their rolls. Our students who enroll in Lincoln Edge receive a Southwestern diploma upon graduation and maintain contact with the district throughout their enrollment. Our costs over the past 3 years, beginning in 21-22, are as follows: $838,000, 22-23, $687,000, and this current year we are budgeted to spend almost $690,000. This cost works out to be approximately $8,300 per student to attend Lincoln Edge. Yes, Lincoln Edge is our online option, and we work with the IU to offer this quality program at what we consider a reduced and fair rate, but it is still a cost that continues to increase each year. All other cyber and brick and mortar schools in the district account for an additional 196 students. This cost for all of the other cyber schools combined over the past 3 years are as follows: 21-22, $2.4 million, 22-23, $2.6 million, and this year budgeted $2.65 million. This cost works out to be approximately $13,500 per student to attend all other cyber and brick and mortar charter schools. Total cost combined in 21-22 was $3.2 million, 22-23, $3.3, and 23-24, $3.34. Even as we see the increase in charter school enrollment and costs, the demands on our district resources, which includes our teachers and facilities, are not reduced correspondingly. This results in additional cost to our district, and in this case, like most, if not all other districts, the cost is significant. A final note that some of my colleagues have addressed or will address is PlanCon. Please note we are sitting in the boardroom of a school building that has recently undergone a $30+ million renovation. And when you leave today, if you pass our high school, you'll notice the start of a $70 million renovation there. While PlanCon is not part of BEF, renovations of our facilities are still a cost driver, and without PlanCon, that money must come from somewhere. In closing, I'm grateful for your time to tell our story today. Your task is not easy and the demands are great. We ask you to continue to talk with us to problem solve and make decisions with us that are best for our students and our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Burkhart. Dr. Van Deusen.
Good morning, Chair Sturla, Chair Phillips-Hill, and members of the Basic Education Funding Commission. My name is Nathan Van Deusen, and I'm in my 5th year as superintendent of the Southeastern School District. The Southeastern School District is a rural to suburban district in southern York County. We have Maryland to our south. To our east, we have the Susquehanna River, and to our west, we have Route 83. Geographically, we're a fairly large district with about 108 square miles, but only 2,600 students, so fairly small with our number of students. Let me begin by thanking members of our General Assembly for working collaboratively to provide significant increases to BEF, SEF, the Ready to Learn Block Grant, and to career and technical education. We are also confident that our representatives will work together to pass a bipartisan fiscal code so that the remaining $1.1 billion can be utilized by school districts across the Commonwealth. A few weeks ago, after meeting with Senator Phillips-Hill, I was asked to provide testimony for this commission. I agreed to this because I see the value in creating connection points between our local school districts and the state representatives in the House and the Senate. These connection points allow local school districts and their representatives a better understanding of public education from the point of view of both parties. Mother Teresa has a following quote that underscores the need for us to connect and collaborate on issues related to public education. She said, "You can do what I cannot do. I can do what you cannot do. Together we can do great things." It's only through these collaborative partnerships that we can provide an excellent, well-funded education for the students of the Commonwealth. My testimony this morning will not be based on my district, Southeastern School District. While our per pupil basic education funding falls in the bottom half of the distribution across the state and definitely places a higher, heavier burden on local taxpayers, I wanted to take my time to identify the issues that I'm perceiving within our state funding formula. After reviewing the calculations on the PDE website, I ran various numbers in a system called 5-Site. I started by looking at district per pupil expenditures across the state. Then I looked closer at BEF per pupil expenditures. I pulled median household income, local effort capacity, real estate market value, and lastly, mill rates for all 499 districts across the Commonwealth. Lastly, I coded each based on quintiles to see if there were trends. I color-coded dark blue for districts doing well in those matrix and dark red for those who are falling in the bottom quintile of the metric. So what did I find? I found that districts who receive higher BEF dollars have low median household income, low effort capacity, and in many cases, lower real estate market value. Conversely, districts with lower BEF subsidy had higher median household income, higher local effort capacity, and higher district real estate market value. So my conclusion was that our BEF is funding those districts who may not have the capacity to generate revenue through local taxing mechanisms. Thus, BEF is doing what it purports to do, sharing more dollars with those districts who may not have the ability to generate the necessary dollars from their real estate taxes. That being said, outside of the correlation between BEF funding to poverty levels, there were anomalies all over the place. One of the greatest anomalies were district mill rates. I initially assumed that these rates would be based on the dollars needed to be made up that weren't provided by basic education funding. As I looked closer, the mill rates seemed to be more connected to county or region than to BEF amount or their poverty levels. I thought to myself, what does this mean? I concluded the current BEF formula tries to fix a multivariate problem with a univariate solution. In other words, poverty and the ability to generate local income should not be the only or most significant driver of our state funding. What is not being thoroughly considered is the expenditure side of the ledger. The truth is that the Commonwealth has 499 unique districts, each with a set of unique challenges, and those challenges drive our spending. There are countless budget drivers that are unique to each of us: district geography, level of student need, infrastructure costs, and many, many more. I'd like to take a few minutes to discuss 3 budget drivers that have a significant impact on district budgets and are not being fully funded. Those expenditures are personnel salaries and benefits, special education costs, and charter school disbursements. Each of these budget drivers are unique to each district and create a great deal of variability across the Commonwealth. This variability is not fully reflected in our current formula, which heavily focuses on district wealth outcomes. The first expenditure driver is salary and benefits. Higher salary and benefits seem to be clustered regionally and based on poverty levels of the district. When I looked at counties such as Chester, Montgomery, and Delaware, districts must pay more salaries and benefits due to the cost of living in the area and regional competition for those positions. Districts such as Lower Merion pays over $134,000 at the top of their pay scale, while more rural districts such as Southern Tioga pay $78,000 at the top of their pay scale. To be competitive regionally, districts in our more affluent counties must compensate their staff at a rate that's commensurate with peers in their region. So for many districts in our affluent regions, these salary schedules create insurmountable funding difficulties for those districts. Lower Merion, for instance, spends over 70% of their budget on salaries and benefits only. This leaves less than 30% for operations, curriculum instruction, student support, and much, much more. From a BEF standpoint, Lower Merion receives the lowest BEF per pupil expenditure in the state at about $665 per student, which puts a larger share of tax burden on the local taxpayer. These dollars must be made up somehow, and we see those through higher mill rates in those regions. The second budget driver that I'll share are the variability in special education costs. Please understand that within special education costs are extreme differences between school districts. Chester Upland, for instance, provides special education to over 25% of their population. This is 8% more than the average school district in the Commonwealth. The cost within each special education district population is also variable. Chester Upland, for instance, spends over $59,000 per pupil for special education services, which is one of the highest per pupil expenditures in the state. To truly understand those costs, though, we must understand that the needs of each student drive the cost of the service within that district. To provide this example further, Chester Upland has more than twice the number of students identified with an intellectual disability than the state average, 12.7% versus 6.2% in our state. Providing support to those with intellectual disabilities can be one of the costliest for our school districts. In many instances, districts need to find outside placements for life skills or MDS placements for students with costs that can be over $150,000 annually. While student need categories are calculated in the special education funding formula, the amount reimbursed, about 25%, never comes close to the outlay of what is needed. The final expenditure driver I'll discuss are charter school expenditures. The cost per student at the top end of a special education student is $60,000 a year, and the top end for a regular education student is about $25,000. Due to the fact that many charter schools are centrally located in our urban settings, our city school districts are hit the hardest financially. Charter school costs are based on an antiquated PDE 363 formula that compensates a charter school for what the sending school offers rather than what the charter school provides. In addition, they compensate charter schools for special education students based on the district average cost rather than the student's actual disability. These overpayments are reflected in district fund balances. In reviewing the testimony, I noticed that 21 of the top 25 public school entities with the highest fund balance based on percentage of revenue were our charter schools. Last January, there was a performance audit report submitted regarding 12 districts in the Commonwealth that added dollars to their fund balance while simultaneously raising their millage rates. While this got some traction across the state with the Auditor General, what the Auditor General failed to mention was that huge fund balances were held by our charter school counterparts. While our charter school counterparts do not have the ability to tax, these astronomical fund balances reflect the fact that our taxpayers are overpaying for an expense, and that should be a red flag. Please understand that I'm not speaking out against school choice. I'm simply in favor of a new calculation that doesn't negatively affect our local taxpayers. So how do we fix these unique cost drivers across the Commonwealth? The first cost driver for our more affluent regions is the cost of salary and benefits. Adding a cost of living calculation in the BEF formula may aid districts whose salary matrices reflect regional income levels. While the average cost per student may be high when compared to other districts across the Commonwealth, the inflated numbers are simply a reflection of the cost of living in that region rather than a reflection of the district's financial health. In many cases, these wealthy districts are receiving a much lower BEF allocation and not sitting on large fund balances and do not end each year with a surplus. Many of these districts have needed to consistently increase mill rates because state funding responsibility was removed, making the local taxpayer bear the burden. Norristown Area School District is a great example, with a salary schedule that reflects other districts in Montgomery County and places a high tax burden on the taxpayers. In addition to salary and benefits, many districts in these affluent regions are dealing with changing demographics and higher level of special education costs, which creates an increased need for more district services. The second budget driver I mentioned was special education costs. As I previously mentioned, the special education funding formula does not compensate districts based on level of need, but it's just not enough. Over the past decade, student needs have drastically increased, and the cost of these services has also enlarged. For smaller districts, students with more complex needs are being educated in outside placements simply because the number of students with a unique need does not necessitate creating a district class for those students. This means paying more for the outside placement services and paying a significant transportation cost to place those students in those placements. So this drives more dollars through the special education. So driving more dollars through the special education funding formula will help all districts handle the astronomical special education costs. The final cost driver affecting all districts across the Commonwealth, but hitting our urban districts the most, are charter school expenditures. I'm encouraged by House Bill 1422, modernizing the cyber charter school law, as a step in the right direction. This House bill looks to set state charter schools rates based upon the services they provide. It updates the special ed charter school calculation. It adds increased transparency in how the dollars are being spent by each charter school. House Bill 1422 is a step in the right direction and will have a significant financial impact on all taxpayers. Our urban districts, who deal with this cost driver the most, will finally feel some reprieve from an antiquated formula that compensates charter schools for what is provided by the home district rather than what's offered by the charter school. As I close, I'd like this commission to understand that the BEF formula cannot be the only answer. While more dollars should be driven to the Commonwealth school districts and tweaks should be made to the formula, other specific funding streams should be made available to help the unique challenges of all districts. For example, infrastructure upgrades in many of the districts across the Commonwealth are necessary. House Bill 1408, PlanCon 2.0, is a step in the right direction. Districts with limited fund balances and heavy financial burdens should be the first to benefit from these dollars. Those districts who have not been able to secure their front entrances and provide basic HVAC upgrades such as air conditioning should be prioritized. PlanCon 2.0 is an opportunity to aid our most financially strapped school districts through basic upgrades to their facility. Last February, the Common Court ruled that Pennsylvania's current system of funding schools is inequitable and must be reformed. As a result, this bipartisan commission has been formed to revamp the state's BEF formula. Voltaire once said, "No problem can stand the assault of sustained thinking." And I'm a firm believer that the partnership between members of this commission and district-level leaders can lead to a sustainable solution that will benefit both the children and taxpayers of the Commonwealth. Distinguished leaders, thank you for allowing me this time to share my thoughts with this commission.
Thank you very much, Dr. Van Deusen, and thank you to all of our testifiers. Turn it over to Representative Isaacson for a question.
Thank you, and thank you for your testimony. And I'm going to take 1 second to thank my chairman of our education committees for the legislation that you highlighted that we have been championing through, and we look forward to hopefully getting it through the House and over to the Senate. But to quickly touch on your testimony, Dr. Burkhart, and certainly you've highlighted it too, is the charter school issue with regard to the funding formula. Again, in Philadelphia, we have the largest amount of charter schools, as you touched upon, Doctor, with regard to the urban setting. But also, you've brought up the cyber charter. The intermediary can do the education at a cost of $8,300, I believe you said. I think that's similar to the numbers that are most of the IUs around the Commonwealth. And certainly after the pandemic, we all understand that school districts around the entire Commonwealth had to learn to adjust and absorb the costs of the technology necessary for educating children when we had to deal with the pandemic and the shutdowns. And that investment is a good investment. We should have the best technology and have our children have access to it, or our students have access to it. But that's also now something that every school district is absorbing, and that cyber component is something every school district is absorbing, and now also absorbing paying that the privately run cyber charter schools for educating public students. So I think that I'm assuming that you're agreeing with our last testifier that we should be considering taking the charter schools out of the funding formula funds that are going to with the school district.
The reform? Yes, 100%. We support that.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure, because certainly we don't want to be, how did you put it in your testimony? That the fund balances are reflecting the fact that our taxpayers are being overpaying for an expense. Because certainly your public school districts are not maintaining a fund balance to the extent that these charter schools are, with the money that the taxpayers have paid over for public school. Correct? All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative Schweier.
Thank you, ma'am. First, to our two superintendents, thank you for having us here, and thank you for your boots on the ground view of education funding, how it's impacting your school district, and also your global view, being part of the community of educational professionals that are so integral to our overall system of education here. I don't have a direct question. This is more of a rhetorical question. And for Dr. Smith and Ms. Barrick as well, I want to continue to talk about the overall question of how many different pots of money should we have in the state versus one overall or one more combined one. I was the author of the school construction bill, so I'm obviously not opposed to the idea of bifurcating some of our funds. But my overall concern is the natural tendency to try to divorce politics from politics that we have when we're having some of these conversations. At any given point in time, any of these things can be used as leverage. And I'm not going to make any kind of broader political statements about any fights that we're in the moment here, because that's not the point of this. I'm not trying to score any sort of cheap political points. However, we do know that these buckets of funding routinely are used as political leverage. Both sides of the aisle, both chambers, we're just as guilty of it as anybody else. And that concerns me for the future. I don't want to see the adequacy and equity targets that have been laid out eloquently by a number of our previous testifiers in previous hearings to be pushed to the side because somebody has an idea that we're going to use this as a way to make sure that we get what we want over here in some other area of policy. So I'm concerned about that just sort of globally, although I understand your perspectives from your business officers, ma'am, and the superintendents and administrators that you represent. So I'm not saying that I disagree with you from a policy standpoint. I just worry about each and every year's politics in Harrisburg changing, and some of these things, very critical things, that are going to be used, again, potentially as leverage. It's not our priority this year. We'll get to it next year, and then we never get back to it, aka Plan Con. And so it's just something that I'm concerned about. It's something that I want to just kind of put on the record as one of the things that I think we have to be mindful of, because General Assembly as it is and the governor as he is right now is going to change, and we have to be mindful of that and sort of built in some of those what I would call safeguards to the shifting political winds of Harrisburg. So that's really all I have in terms of a rhetorical question, but I very much appreciate the incredible amount of work and both your organizations are very much partners with all four of our caucuses and the administration, and I look forward to continuing that relationship. I think I speak for all of us when we say we have a great deal of respect for not only the work that you do and the information that you provide, but the way that you provide it as well. I think it's very important to say that.
Can I respond to you on that, Representative Schreier? Thank you. So I hear you, and that's always a concern, right? So you make a decision, and then it's not followed through in future decisions. However, maybe in that regard, you got to remember special education costs within a district can fluctuate tremendously in one year from another. The dynamics on that changes. So actually putting that into as a part of the overall BEF formula just really doesn't work. It's going to fluctuate too much, and I think it's going to offset other types of the metrics if you do that. The Plan Con is, not every school needs to be building at the same time. So within the BEF formula, honestly, as a superintendent, I always have money that was placed in there for maintenance and operations and taking care of our facilities, because if you can do that, then the actual big projects are less that you have to do that. So I think that's one of the important things, Representative Sterling, you were talking about. So having some of that funding in the BEF is great, but we are so far behind with the facilities and across the Commonwealth. Some of our kiddos that are students that are being funded.
Kiddos are
They're
fine.
Always kiddos. Sorry.
You're a longtime educator. I think you have the right to say that.
Thank you. And my kindergartners were my little poppers, just so you know. So, we need to catch up. So that's the Plan Con will help us to provide those schools that are so far behind to do that. But maybe you can look at it to help your perspective on that you put everything within the filing cabinet, and there's just those drawers of each one of those fundings in that. So maybe there's a way, as you're looking at what that adequacy is, you should be looking at all those buckets into one big overarching picture. So if there's some way maybe to organize that under that bigger umbrella, maybe that helps to alleviate some of that concern that you have, and I think all of us would have for future years and funding.
And I think that's fair. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Representative. If I can follow up on that, we've had this conversation through our hearings with regard to facilities and facility needs. And do your districts maintain up-to-date facility plans that are informed by architects and engineers?
Depends.
Can I answer that?
Yeah, please.
So you're in a boardroom right now in a building that was built in the 90s, and it looks fantastic because it just went through renovation. Now, I would say that I would put our facility team and our director up against anybody. They are top-notch. They maintain our buildings, and even a district where the buildings are maintained and they are under review, and we have a cycle where we go through and we touch a building every 20, 25 years through the planning, it still can't keep up with the costs and the things and the wear and tear. When you think about you're sitting in a building with about 1,200 kids up and down these hallways, even terrazzo starts to wear out. And so even the best of the best and the best plans cannot keep up with the wear and tear that the kids put on it. And that's wear and tear that we welcome because they're here, they're excited. Kids want to learn, they're in the classrooms. So I would say that when you're sitting in here and you're looking around, the facilities maintained by some of the best people I've ever worked with still can't keep up with the cost that's required to maintain them.
I understand. I truly do. And back when I was in that position of having to help make decisions about buildings, labor is going to cost the same whether you put in terrazzo or you put in linoleum, but we know that the terrazzo is going to last longer, right? So I get all that. I think from my perspective sitting here and having these conversations, we're going to need that information to inform the General Assembly about funding any type of plan con or facility maintenance bucket that we contemplate. So I think in that regard, I always say, we don't know what people don't tell us. I will never purport, and I think most of my colleagues who are sitting up here with me would never tell you we know everything, right? So we're going to look to you to tell us really what those facility needs are going to be so that we can make those informed decisions with regard to that type of funding.
Senator, if I may.
Yes.
So let's remember those big projects for our districts that do not have enough of the BF funding and state funding. They're going to have to look into their local tax base to fund that, and I think that's where some of the facilities do not get maintained or updated. Is that the tax base just doesn't want to absorb any more local taxes to do a big building project, and so the decision is to let it go. And I think that's the wear and tear that happens across that. So I don't think it's a desire not to keep up with the facilities, but I think it's really, again, it comes down to the funding and the impacts on the local taxpayers.
And that was not, if that was the way that you took that, that was certainly not what I intended to infer. I'm just saying we need to get a sense from you as to where that need is, what the potential costs could be, so we can make informed decisions when we're voting on buckets of money and constructing formulas.
Concur. We've talked about, I've heard you in the budget hearings for years talk about the fact that we need that data to make decisions on what we need for facilities. So I highly recommend that we have that data to make those decisions.
Thank you.
In my recommendation would be that the General Assembly starts with what's the priority. So we prioritize what the projects are that that the state will be able to fund. Prioritize front entrances. I know school security is a big thing. Prioritize. I know that there are many districts in our cities that don't have HVAC upgrades, that don't have basic air conditioning. So that would be my point here, is we need to prioritize those things that are the most needed to educate the students in the Commonwealth in the best way.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Senator Lindsey Williams. She is online.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you to the panel for your testimony, and thank you, Dr. Burkhart, specifically for your testimony that helped draw a picture for us, a very visual picture of our schools and the strings between the chairs and the interconnectedness of our communities. We've talked a lot about buckets. And also, we've talked about increasing special education costs, and we've talked about that cost as a bucket. But I think I want to remind us all that that funding is not just a bucket, and it's not simply a burden. Some special education students have high needs that cost a lot that we are legally obligated to provide. But these students are an important part of our school communities. And while some of their funding comes from a special education line item or a bucket, we should be careful not to other them either. The lines between special education students and our quote unquote traditional students is getting blurrier and blurrier, and it should. Environments that are safe are good for all students. Environments that are accommodating for our neurodivergent students help all students. Additional paraprofessionals help special education students, but they also help the other students in that classroom be able to learn. And we've heard repeatedly about the dire need for mental health supports for all students. Those are costs that are coming out of the basic ed funding line item, school counselors, therapists, etc. So I just say all that to remind everybody that's listening that there are students on the other end of these conversations, and that making sure that we have a fully adequately funded pie means that all of those kids get what they need. And I think that's important that we continue to focus on that. And I welcome any feedback to that comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Williams. I'm a past special education teacher, so nobody could be more passionate about those children than me.
I know that.
And it's not I hear you in the sensitivity to it. And I would tell you that was always a difficult conversation at the school board table when we had to look at those costs. And absolutely can't agree with you more that there is more and more students with all kinds of unique needs that are in our classrooms, whether they're mental health, emotional, 504 plans because of other health issues, and absolutely just using that as an example of when we have to look at unique needs of our children that have that. We need looking through that funding formula for that, because again, the amount of students that are funneled through an IEP system in each one of our schools is very different, like the level of needs. So that formula, your special education formula, is just another bucket. Sorry, there's the bucket again, but another bucket that is incredibly important to meet the unique needs of the schools. And I think it's more that way. Certainly under the general education budget, those students are in our regular education classrooms and everything else, and the costs are absorbed in there. It's just when you need the specialized assistance for those students that it comes through the special education formula.
Absolutely understand that.
Yeah, and my comment to that would simply be, I couldn't agree with you more in terms of they're all our kids. And, our board of school directors, our teachers, our administrators, we're going to find a way to make it work because the kids get what they need, and they should. And so we always say that in our district, all our students are Mustangs. That's our mascot. So they're not Mustangs because they're in this class or that class. They're Mustangs, and they're all entitled to get what they need. And I'm like my colleagues here and all throughout the Commonwealth, we make it work. And I agree with you 100%. They're all our kids.
And just a last comment here. Our decisions are made at the student level based on the IEP of the student. We, as Jay just mentioned, we make that work. So we may have to make that work with increased millage costs or those things. But from a student level standpoint, we are the ones that figure out to make the IEP, to put the IEP in place.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to Representative Topper for a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Smith, we've talked before about something you mentioned in the last page of your testimony, which is the programmatic targets. So as we figure out the funding formula and the mechanism to do that, I assume in there you're talking about what the state is saying we need to hit in terms of programs that are available to students. And so I've been struggling through this process of trying to decide. It's going to be on us to recommend what is the adequate education. In other words, what does each student need to have access to in order to meet that marker? So my question is, because this is that battle between local control and state, we'll call them mandates, initiatives, whatever you want to call it. But what needs to determine what is going to be accessible to each student, because that will ultimately also determine, how we drive some of this money out.
Sure. Thank you, Representative, for that question. So, I always, when I budgeted at a district level as a superintendent, I would always look at what the needs of my students were first. So, what's your goals? And then the budgeting always followed that in as far as determining what that is. So, as you're looking at that across a huge holds a huge commonwealth with the significant unique needs of our schools, certainly I think we have to look at what the students need to get an appropriate instructional education. And then you have all the supports that surrounding them. Again, to me, that in the basic education formula does, I think, a pretty good job of looking at how you funnel that based on the local differences through that formula. But I find it really difficult for you to sit up there and make a decision about what adequate funding would be, or equitable opportunities for students, if you don't have some goal in mind of what that looks like. And so to answer your questions about what that is, I could certainly brainstorm that, and send something that way, but I'm not prepared to make a statement.
But I look at it like again, as you budgeted, you said, what are your students' needs, right? And then you're going to determine it based off that. Well, that's what, if we have those roles and we're the superintendent and you're the students, we're trying to figure out, well, what are the needs of each school? So should there be art in every building of every school? Because if we determine that is part of it, then that needs to go into our factors as well. So I guess, yes, anything that you as an association could do, and we can even, bring you back to another hearing later on to say, okay, this is what adequacy means in terms of access. And I think it was Dr. Burkhart, could have been, maybe I'm wrong, but talked about the instruction from school to school. If a school has a particular teacher or subject matter that we can somehow integrate into another school district that doesn't have that, those kind of things. Any kind of programmatic targets, I think we need to be aware of those. We need to have a good understanding of what needs to be in every building and what does not. So if that's something we could circle back on later, I'd appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative. I'll turn it over to Senator Hughes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I've heard a lot of reference to PlanCon, and that's all well and good. But PlanCon didn't work. Look at the condition of our school buildings across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. What I think we're going to need from you, tasked with this responsibility, is what other concepts or ideas that might be available or brainstorm that we should be thinking about to address the infrastructure issue. This is a great building, originally built in 1990, right? Yes. I've been in a building in Senator Miller's district built before 1890. Am I right, sir? 1874. All right. And so again, having had that experience of working through the commission to deal with school infrastructure and PlanCon, there was one of the issues that came up is there's no statewide assessment. There's no compilation of information, of data, or if there's any, it's kind of loosey-goosey, okay, based on what districts might provide up, all right? And in fact, I think we were going through that process at the same time that I believe Philadelphia had just completed its infrastructure assessment with the professionals and what have you that are necessary to do that. And there was some vagaries in even that assessment as well. It was multi-billion dollars. And so, so that we don't have to have any more buckets, Dr. Smith, right? All right. But that we do have to recognize that in far too many cases there are buckets inside school buildings that are collecting water that have to be confronted, or that there's infestation issues inside school buildings that have to be confronted, or that there's lead or asbestos or other toxic materials inside school buildings that are impeding teachers from teaching, students from learning. Little popcorns, is that what you call them, Dr. Smith? Little poppers, okay. Yeah. And so we're going to need that, all right? The Commonwealth Court judge, Commonwealth Court president judge, accepted the professor as the court has essentially ruled that the professor's assessments are the standard. That's what Commonwealth Court, this is the standard. This is what he said. But he did not take into account the facility conversation. And I think he didn't take into account the early learning issues, okay? And we all know that grade level reading and math by third, fourth grade is, again, another gold standard in terms of predicting future success. Future acting, there's no dispute in that. But we're going to need that, okay, to help make a good bipartisan decision, all right, to how we need to go forward. And so, Dr. Smith, you're the head of all of them, all right? So that's what it says right here, the executive director, all right? So, it falls on you, okay, to help us get that kind of information, or maybe that kind of creative thinking that we're looking for to try to figure out some of these issues that previously has put us in a situation where under this mandate by a court.
I can't agree with you more on most of that, Senator, to be honest with you. Having been a superintendent that did 6 plan cons in the past, I wouldn't want to put any other superintendent through that process. But they did do a revamp of that plan con system, so it's much better. That's the good news of it. But I think we all relate back to that because that's what we know. And we know that we need money for our facilities. And we understand that there's too many unhealthy buildings out there that we're putting our prized possessions in. I will tell you, when I became superintendent, there was one building that did not have air conditioning and went into those classrooms when it was 90 degrees. My heart just bled for those children to try to learn in that classroom. So I understand, I think, the immense responsibility it is to try to get all of our facilities, some of them well over 100 years old, up to some kind of condition that is inviting for our students to come into. You put those bright lights in those classrooms, and it makes such a difference in the learning and in the motivation to learn. So we can work on that, but again, partnering with you. You have my full dedication as the executive director, you say, but no, that means that I'm going to be working with our members because they're the mind power behind what we do at PASA, and we'll gladly help you to gather as much information as we can in regards to that, but we need your help sometimes to collect that information. Having been a past Pennsylvania Department of Education person, I can tell you we can't collect any more data without you giving us permission to do so. But when it comes directed through there, you get all the information because it's collected. For us, we can ask for that information, but we don't have the teeth, so to speak, to make sure that we collect all that information. And I think when it comes to school facilities, you want to get it from all of the school systems, so you get a full picture of that. So gladly talk with you more about that and assist in that regard.
Thank you. Forgive me, everyone. I refer to Dr. Clayton a lot because, again, this is, as we speak, her homegoing services are going on in Philadelphia, and I'm not there, but I think she'd rather I be here to help deal with this issue. And the issue of creativity comes up when I reflect upon her. And there was an issue about an assessment done during her time as superintendent about a number of students not having full math capabilities. So she creatively called up Temple University and said, give me all your teachers, give me all your professors, and this summer we're going to address that.
Awesome.
And it got addressed.
Beautiful.
Creative thinking,
Yes.
commitment, and a commitment to the students, knowing that they can learn if they've given the opportunity. And I think all we're asking for, and I think I'm on safe ground here with the rest of my colleagues, is some creative thinking. We have a mandate from the Commonwealth Court to solve a very big problem that's been around for generations. And thinking inside the current box may not be the way to get to the best solution or to achieve an appropriate response to that mandate. Need some creativity, need some extra think. You all manage this stuff on a day-to-day basis, and we thank you very much. Really do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Sturla.
Thank you. I want to continue on this facilities issue for a second because I talked about my back of the napkin calculation earlier for new facilities and it being somewhere between $1.5 billion and $2 billion a year if we did a 100-year plan. I also know that in that interim, you need to renovate a building every 33 years or so. So for every 100-year period, you're going to rebuild once and you're going to renovate twice. And those renovations aren't cheap, as you pointed out, $35 million in this building here. So when I did that back of the napkin calculation, that was another $1.5 billion a year that we needed to be spending on those. And that, I think, maybe gets put in that bucket that is that separate bucket that says we don't just fund that through the funding formula. We figure out a way to do this and who's paying for it and how. But there's also then ongoing maintenance costs. And those, I think, should be in the basic ed formula. Would you agree that those sort of ongoing maintenance costs, like, hey, window broke, hey, this happened, that's got to be part of what you're looking at every year, because it's going to be the same for everybody.
Makes perfect sense to run that through the BF. Yep.
Okay. And my back of the napkin calculation on that was $1 billion a year, but that, you know. So what I'd ask you all is, we don't have that comprehensive statewide survey, but I don't think I need to know what all 500 school districts individually look like. I should be able to say, you have a really good plan for how you maintain facilities in a 50-year plan, 100-year plan, whatever it is. Can I find 50 school districts like you throughout the state that are some rural, some suburban, some urban, and say, what is your number? And then I can say, and how many students do you represent? And I can take that times the total number or divide it by the total number of students, and I can come up with, if you guys think it's going to cost you X amount of billions of dollars, how many is it going to cost statewide? That, again, it's just a back of the napkin kind of calculation, but it's better than I have no clue, which is where I'm at right now. I'm like, I have no clue. I mean, my back of the napkin calculations were based on probably costs $100 million for a new high school. I have no clue whether that's even remotely close. I could be off by 50%. But you guys could have a better idea and get us closer on that number so that even if I'm within 25% of where I think I need to be, it's better than I have no clue whether my number is even remotely accurate. Is that something you all could do for us?
That's a nice suggestion. Yep, I think we can help with that, and I'm certainly going to put my friends at PASBO on the hook on helping me with that as well.
All right, okay. And one final question, if I could, and this relates to the charters. From my perspective, the cyber charters are the ones that are sucking more money off that's in excess than the brick and mortar charters. And I don't know whether that's your experience or not. I mean, I have a small cyber charter in my district that's a brick and mortar that is costing significantly less per pupil and doing significantly more than the cyber charter students. And the cyber charter that's doing that for them is.
So I'll give this Nate. He's nipping at the butt on that one. So,
okay.
But let me just kind of give you the perspective on that. I think the cyber charters has an impact on all 500 of the school districts.
Okay.
You know, the brick and mortar charters are more centric to different parts of the state. So that's one difference. I think the other difference is, I think if you talk to any of our school leaders across the state, the cost of educating a student in a brick and mortar building is very different from what the costs are for us for a cyber charter student. And so it may, going back to 1422, the separation of how the funding for cyber charter students in our charter schools should look different than what it does for our brick and mortars. It's a different cost difference. And so, when we talk about equity of funding, I think that's for all students, right? It's not just for in the districts, that's for all students. So what's the equity of funding for our students that are educated in our fellow public schools of charters and cyber charters?
Okay.
So I think the issue here is the PDE 363 formula. So every September, every superintendent across the Commonwealth signs a PDE 363 form that identifies what we pay to a charter school, cyber charter or brick and mortar. And the problem with that calculation is there's no deductions for the things that those cyber charters or charter schools don't provide. For instance, most of the cyber charter or most of the charter school expenditures that my district uses are cyber charter schools. Those cyber charter schools that are in our formula that give us a cost per pupil include technical education, vocational education. So our tech ed kids are all part of our per pupil expenditure. Athletics, extracurricular things that our kids do after school. And a lot of these entities don't provide those things. So really, when you look at the back of that PDE 363 form, the only deduction is transportation. And even if that was updated by what's provided by those cybers, it would be a huge benefit to the local school districts because they are not, the reason why they have such big fund balances is because they are not providing what we're providing in our local school districts.
So specific to that and that formula, as it relates to special ed costs, because you point out, hey, your average cost is $59,000. What I've seen, and tell me whether this is true or not for you, the charter and cyber charters aren't taking the special ed kid that's the $125,000 cost, that's above the average cost. They're taking the kid that's got a reading disability or a speech therapy disability that costs $2,000 and saying, but you owe us $25,000 for that kid because that's the average. Is there some cherry picking going on there that you see?
So the way the special education formula works on the PDE 363 is they add the cost of the regular education student to the average cost of what the district spends for special ed, and that is your number. So I'll give you for an instance, ours is about $35,000. The problem is that $35,000 for the most part, you don't have an MDS kid that is costing you $150,000 going to a cyber charter school. Right. You have a student with an articulation problem that needs 15 minutes of speech every other week that's getting that $35,000 from the local taxpayer. So it's more about the calculation of what the district provides in generally averages than really what's being provided in that service by the charter school.
All right. Yeah, I agree. That's something we absolutely need to address because it probably means we could put $1 billion more into basic education that wasn't going into somebody's pocket or somebody's excess line.
We have the representative. We have the tiered system through our special education formula: Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 students. So using that, it would make a whole lot more, I think, equitable funding for the students that attend our cyber charters with IEPs.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Look, I really appreciate your testimony here today. I'm hearing predictable, stable, sustainable funding. I'm hearing that there are cost drivers and there are mandates and that there's a need for alleviation of these mandates. And I think, Dr. Van Deusen, you really said it best when you said the funding formula is working the way it is intended and that there are improvements needed. We hear you loud and clear. So, Representative Sterla, do you have anything you want to say to sum this up?
I just want to thank the people who testified today. As has been the case with every hearing so far, there are a lot of points that get made that are extremely important to what we're trying to get accomplished here, and this has been very helpful today with your testimony, so thank you.
Madam Chair.
Thank you. And
can I note that The time is 12:57. And
Sir,
that I will compliment my colleague in the Senate for running an efficient and timely meeting, okay?
Thank you, good Senator. We senators
man.
stick together. Before we leave, I have to acknowledge and enter into the Commission's record letters that have been received by the Property Tax Elimination Working Group through Mr. Ron Snell of Williamsport, as well as a letter from the African American Charter School Coalition. They will be in our official record. Thank you again to today's testifiers, our host district, including Dr. Burkhart and all of his team, as well as the fellow commission members, and of course those from the public who are here in person and watching along virtually. Our next commission meeting will be on Thursday, October 5th. We will be up in Hazleton, and all information, including testimony provided today, can be found on the commission's website, and that is basiceducationfundingcommission.com. All comments that are submitted through the website are made publicly available and will be part of the Commission's official record. And with that, the Commission stands in recess until the call of the chairs. Thank you again.